The Sith of Brockton Bay by Illuviar. 1. Phase 1, Parts 1 and 2. Disclaimer: I do not own Star Wars of Worm. They belong to their respective copyright owners. This story is not created with commercial purpose. I make no money from it. Ayan, this part was betrayed by Ceruleum on the Space Battles forums. Thank you for the time and effort you put in betraying this story. The Sith of Brockton Bay =SBB=. Prologue. Place unknown. Time irrelevant. This wasn't meant to happen. A voice cut through the crimson haze which had fallen upon my mind some time ago. It only made my fury grow even further. She wasn't supposed to die. Taking myself under a semblance of control, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The only reason I was able to was because some part of my fragmenting mind recognized the voice. She was my patron. The being who had hurled me in this dimension gave me a second chance. Or so I had thought before getting back my memories a short time ago. You, I hissed, my mind grabbing at the echo of power I could feel within myself. I'm sorry, it's all wrong, she pleaded. A trickle of power flowed through me, making my mind a bit clearer and blowing most of the haze away. All I wanted at that moment was to lash out against the woman, using every bit of energy I could grasp. Yet I stayed my hand despite the molten river of rage that flowed through my veins. I glared at her, all the power I had at my disposal right now. It wouldn't even tickle her. Here and now, in my broken, useless, mere human body, I couldn't touch her. That did nothing to temper my hatred. So that's how it is. I'm a mere plaything for your sick amusement, I spat. Don't be ridiculous, my lost knight. You are one of my agents. Her voice softened. You did all I asked you to. It was supposed to be your reward, a fresh start. She paused. A new life, I sneered. A reward. I spat the word as if it was made of vinegar. To bury my wife again. To helplessly watch my daughter suffer and be broken. The Force only knows what would happen to her now. All the while, I had no memory of my past lives. I roared, not caring in the least that the being in front of me made gods tremble in fear. I'm sorry, all right. I fucked up. It's all wrong. You should have triggered and remembered. She looked at me with pity in her eyes. I'll make it better, she whispered. Make it right. I snorted in derision. =SBB=. January 13th, 2011, St. Mary's Hospital, Brockton Bay. Keeping a lid on my temper while I watched my daughter sleep in her hospital bed was a tall order. The fact that once again I was remembering multiple lives didn't help all that much, neither the fresh, raw wound of knowing that I had buried my wife 2 years ago. My eyes darted to the white ceiling and I glared at it and the sky beyond. I knew it now. It was all a goddamned setup. The whole life I lived on this wretched world, its sole purpose was to give me an emotional attachment. Not to this so-called Earth bet, but to my now-deceased wife, and to my daughter who was slumbering next to me, hopped up on sleeping pills and antibiotics. I seethed. I knew precious little about this world, besides whatever I remembered as Danny. The mere basics, what a native inhabitant would know, though they contained a few very useful and deadly pieces of information. Yet that didn't matter. It was something to consider at a later time. What was important? My daughter's fate here was to suffer. Her whole life was supposed to be suffering and conflict, and as Daniel Hebert, I did nothing to help her for the past 2 years since Annette died. I left her to suffer alone. And if my guess was right, the person I was without my other memories would have continued to do so, letting her down. Which said a lot of things about me, none of which were flattering. To make things worse, there was a part of me that believed that all this was even a bigger setup, that one might thing. That I had never lived Danny's life and was instead dumped in his body and given his memories, which might very well be true. Yet, my eyes fell on Taylor's sleeping figure. She was snorting cutely, her face half hidden by the curls of her hair. I remember holding her as a newborn baby. How proud I was. The way I fell in love with this little girl the moment I saw her. How afraid I was that I wouldn't be a good enough father. And I wasn't. My heart clenched. What she had experienced, the little bit I knew of her future, was nearly enough to throw me into a homicidal rage. As if somehow sensing the state of my mind, Taylor started moving restlessly in her sleep. Exhaling loudly, I clamped down on my anger, not letting it direct my thoughts. Using a facet of my power, I sent calming waves to my daughter and smiled when she relaxed in her sleep. Gently placing a hand upon her right hand, which was resting over her blanket, I sighed in relief. I needed to keep a lid on my feelings around her right now. She needed all the rest she could get. It wasn't a hard decision. What to do now that I had my memories back? When I wasn't powerless any longer, I would protect my little girl even if I had to burn this force-forsaken world to the ground myself. =SBB Phase 01, Setting Up the Pieces. Part 1, January 13th, 2011. St. Mary's Hospital, Brockton Bay. It took all my willpower not to choke Alan Barnes, someone who, as Danny I considered a friend. Not to mention the principal of Taylor's school. We were outside of my daughter's hospital room, and those two bastards were faking concern for her well-being. All the while trying to subtly hint that me suing their assess-off would be a terrible idea. I understand how you feel, Danny. Barnes continued to drone on, oblivious to the fact that I was close to snapping his neck. However, think about it. The medical bills, involving Taylor in the madhouse such a lawsuit will entail, won't help her recovery, and you might not be there for your daughter while dealing with the courts. If you sue Winslow, win or lose, I'm not sure you'll have the finances to help her while everything is settled. I'm a divorce lawyer, Danny. While I'm ready to take you case pro bono, I feel representing you against the school will be doing you and your daughter a disservice. I can get you in contact with the best lawyers in the city, but they are very expensive. And frankly, you'll need it. There appears to be precious little evidence that the police found at the scene. That utter bastard, the fact that his precious daughter was one of the walking corpses who put my little girl in the hospital, had nothing to do with it. Nah, Al had my best interests at heart. Right. If you believed that I had a nice seaside resort to sell you, great climate and beach, straight in the middle of Tatooine's Dune Sea. The neighbors were very nix fellas as well. Still, he was right about one thing. Right now, my resources were rather limited. Oh, they were enough to pay the medical bills for Taylor and whatever else she will need to recover, but a prolonged legal battle was out of the question. Even a short one wasn't something I should be able to pay for. Well, not as Danny Hebert, the union rep. I smiled thinly at the two beings standing in front of me. As the bloody Dark Lord of the Sith, I had many options. Oh, don't concern yourself with my finances, Alan. I'll manage. I turned my gaze towards the principal, giving her my undivided attention. I let most of the ordinary middle-class persona of Danny bleed off my face. Principal Blackwell, you want to make a deal. To sweep it all under the rug and avoid bad publicity, counting on the fact that I might be unable to afford the medical bills for Taylor and sue you into the ground at the same time. She flinched and opened her mouth to rebuke me. I raised a hand and glared at her. I'm not done. It's curious, isn't it? How the police found little to no evidence, no witnesses to speak of. I trailed off. If I was paranoid, I would have wondered if there wasn't some kind of cover-up. Besides the obvious little fact that you want to cover your ass. My smile grew vicious. Danny, I know you've been through a lot lately, but please don't throw such accusations around. It won't help either you or Taylor, Alan pleaded. Indeed, Mr. Herbert, such insinuations. Spare me the being offended act, Blackwell. If you had done your job, we wouldn't be here. My lawyer will be contacting you. Now get out of my sight. I strode past them and entered Taylor's room. Criff it all to hell. I nearly lost it with those two. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Letting my anger control me while I was in the same building with my kid was a very bad idea. First thing I needed was some resources. Second, I needed to decide if I should work through the protectorate or not. Being an independent cape had its pros and cons, yet in the long term I might be able to do more working within the system instead of clashing headlong with them. Most of the gangs weren't a strategic threat for me, with two exceptions, the ABB, thanks to Lung. Until I faced him, I had no idea if I could take him. Once that he was at full power, There was always the option of assassinating him. Then there were the Nazis. They had numbers, both ordinary soldiers and capes, plus the finances. Not to mention a charismatic and powerful leader, a big problem that just crushing by myself will be impractical or even impossible. Yet there was the elephant in the room. Coil. Oh, I needed to deal with the bastard either way, yet should I kill him or use him? Decisions. =SBB=. January 14th, 2011. St. Mary's Hospital, Brockton Bay. It was strange. Taylor felt calm, safe. There was that nagging thought in the back of her mind that it was somehow wrong. Yet she couldn't put her finger on what it was. She was warm, covered with something soft. Her mind was fuzzy, like it was filled with cotton. All she wanted was to stay that way, safe, content. It's time to awaken, sleeping beauty. That voice. It was familiar. It took her a moment or two to place it. Ah, Dad. Taylor fought the fog in her head and cracked open an eye. Then she immediately shut it due to the blinding light. She scrunched her face in annoyance, prompting an amused snort from her father. She opened her eyes again, and this time the light wasn't blinding, just too bright for comfort. Dad, Taylor muttered. Her brain was working so slowly. The room was unfamiliar, white and blurry without her glasses. What was this place? Last thing she remembered. Taylor shuddered. It was cold and dark. Oh God, the smell. The crawling. No, she whispered. No, I need out, please. Her heart was hammering within her chest, doing its best to break free too. She needed to get away, to break free. Shh. Princess, it's all right. You are safe now. A wave of emotions washed over Taylor, chasing the panic away. She felt hands embracing her and holding her tightly. Somehow she could feel her dad's emotions, his concern. As he continued to hold her, she relaxed in his hands. Taylor could feel that he loved her more than anything else in this world. It wasn't a self-delusion of a scared little girl. She actually knew that Danny cared for her, that he loved her. She sniffed and returned his embrace, gripping him as if he was her lifeline. And for a moment she allowed herself to believe that everything might be all right after all. They stayed that way a long time, content from the contact. =SBB=. January 14th, 2011. Docks, Brockton Bay. I stalked through the night using the Force to cloak myself in shadows. I knew this district like the back of my hand. It came with the territory, being a Union rep and all, which meant that I was roughly aware what parts of the docks were claimed by the different gangs. A few hours ago I left the hospital after Taylor finally dozed off. The fact that I had to use the Force to calm her down and keep her from panicking when she started to remember what happened to her was infuriating. For the time being, my control was rather frayed, and the fact that I wholeheartedly agreed with the whispers of the dark side in the back of my head didn't help me much. I needed to vent my bubbling rage onto something. So I was here, searching for a suitable target, one that would not only give me satisfaction, but also some needed resources. I smiled coldly when I turned around a corner and saw a warehouse which I knew to be abandoned. However, there were dull lights coming from a few of its broken windows. At its main entrance, I could make out two figures leaning on the wall near the rusty gate. They looked frayed in their black leather clothes. I could clearly see dots of light in front of their faces. How foolish. The sorry excuses for sentries, because it was obvious what their purpose for being there tonight was smoking. Probably weed or something more exotic, which had the nice side effect of ruining their night vision. And that was quite important, because the street was mostly dark. All but a few of the lamps were shattered, and no one had bothered to replace them. Splendid. I stalked from shadow to shadow, extending my senses. You've got to love the Force. It took me moments to figure out that there were 10 people in the warehouse, counting the so-called sentries. All merchants to boot. Did I mention that I really didn't like drug dealers? Dealing with that many gangbangers in the body of Danny Hebert, even now that I had my memories and skills back, would have been a tall task, especially considering that I had no equipment to speak of. However, I had the Force, which made all the difference in the world. I used the Force to put one of the guards in stasis while I grabbed the other one in a telekinetic grip. He tried to scream, but found his throat clenched by invisible fingers. I clenched my right hand in a fist and smiled, hearing the unmistakable sound of breaking bones. Moment later, I laid the corpse on the ground and turned to my next victim. Striding next to him, I looked the merchant in the eyes and pressed into his mind. As expected, he had no defenses to speak of. Whatever natural resistance he might once had been eroded by years of taking all drugs known to man and then some. I browsed through his memories, paying no heed to being careful. It wasn't like I was going to let him live. Before his mind shattered, I found some interesting information. I had hit the jackpot. Indeed, there was a stash of money and drugs in the warehouse. No merchant capes in the district as far as the man knew, which was good. Further, right now the gang had only 2 parahumans. I vaguely remembered that they should will have another one, a woman tinker, but they obviously hadn't recruited her yet. I make a note about that. Considering what was commonly known about the merchant's MO, which was confirmed by this piece of trash, she very well might be forced to join them under duress. Or not. Time will tell. At any rate, I wasn't here to save everyone. I let the brain-dead man slide to the ground and went inside. Just another shadow in the night. A few minutes later, it was all over, leaving me disappointed. The merchants were all dead. What I found was enough to make me sick, and that's saying something, considering that I was a Sith Lord who had burned whole worlds without losing any sleep over it. That left me to decide what to do with the spoils of war. The money was a lot. Let me tell you, about $1 million, mostly in small bills, takes up a lot of volume. Not to mention the crates filled with various drugs. I filled the backpack I had taken from home before heading this way with stacks of 50s and 100s before searching the place for some flammable materials. A couple of minutes later, I levitated barrels with chemicals, which I found in a nearby storage room. A bit of improvisation, and the warehouse was ready to go up in flames half an hour from now. I smiled at a work well done and melted in the night. =SBB Part 2. January 15th, St. Mary's Hospital, Brockton Bay. Making Taylor's room reasonably secure against unwanted eavesdroppers was surprisingly easy. First step was using a low-level electromagnetic field, just in case, produced by fine-tuning a trickle of force lighting. Next, dampening the sound around us and using shadows to prevent someone reading our lips just in case that there was a hidden camera. Though I checked for both surveillance and bugs, finding nothing. What can I say? I'm paranoid. On the bright side, Taylor had an adorable expression on her face when she saw me manipulate the shadows around us. I grinned cheekily at her. What? How? When? She spluttered, frowning cutely. Dad, you are a cape, she squealed. Taylor pointed an accusing finger at my chest. You, mister, are in big trouble. Give. I want to know everything. She sat up in her bead and leaned towards me. Well, sweetie, that's a very long story. Obviously, that was the wrong thing to say, because Taylor decided to strike preemptively, making puppy dog eyes at me. I don't know how she managed to pull it off, but she looked like a little angel. Nope, I will not be revealing any deep dark secrets tonight. Daddy, please, she drawled. I blame Annette for this. When she made this exact expression, combined with that tone of voice, I couldn't deny her anything. And Taylor was like a younger copy of her mother. So much for Sith courage. I slumped back in my chair and theatrically facepalmed. Vanquished by a teenager, I moaned. My daughter giggled at my antics. I got my powers few days ago. I started in a serious tone. As to how, I shrugged. I wasn't about to tell her about my patron and all I've been doing in other dimensions. My kid had more than enough on her plate without knowing that her dad was possibly the greatest mass murderer on the face of this planet, with the possible exception of the Endbringers. That's not something I'm ready to talk about. Ah. Taylor pouted but let the topic rest. She had a faraway look for a few moments, then her eyes brightened. Oh my God, my dad is going to be a hero. I could clearly hear the capital H. I couldn't stop a sad expression from creeping up my face. Hero. Outside my side's propaganda in the various conflicts I've been part of, there were precious few instances in which I could be called such. Indeed, barring a miracle, in order to keep Taylor reasonably safe, more often than not, I would have to be a monster in this world too. It couldn't be helped. Earthbet was a fucked up place where high ideals and morals would see you dead. That wasn't something I could afford. I looked at my little girl. I had too much to lose to do anything less but my best. Instead, I changed the topic. Is that what you want, kiddo? To be a hero? For a moment, Taylor beamed at me. Sure, she exclaimed before her expression dropped. She stared at her bedsheets. I'm just ordinary old Taylor, nothing special. She muttered, biting her bottom lip. As Danny, I've been a criffin clueless moron. I should have noticed, her low self-esteem and everything else. I got up from my chair and embraced her gently. Shh, shh, Taylor, as your father I have the luxury of telling you when you are wrong. You aren't ordinary, love. I released her from my hug and gently picked up her chin so she could look me in the eyes. You are Taylor Hebert, and you are awesome. She sniffed and gave me a small smile. Thanks, Daddy. Going back to my chair, I schooled my face in a pleasant smile. Taylor's sudden mood changes were concerning, but considering that she was not only filled with various drugs, but only days from her trigger event, she was acting relatively normal. Nevertheless, I knew that it will be a long time before she could be considered to be anywhere near being fine. She would need help, and not only from me, but from a professional who deals with capes and trigger events. Doing anything less would be irresponsible, which meant either the Protectorate or New Wave, though the former might be able better to help Taylor. Besides, keeping her away from Glory Girl and her aura would be good, Coil notwithstanding, with him actually being a member of the Protectorate in this city. Taylor, thanks to one of my powers, I have a pretty good reason to believe that you are now a cape too. What? Me? She shrieked. Yeah, the sound dampening around us was a very good idea. There wasn't a reason to give someone a heart attack. Yep, my little girl is a heroine. I'm so proud, I exclaimed, shedding a tear. To be fair, there was a pretty big part of me that wished for Taylor to be an ordinary teenager on a safe world. Fuck Brockton Bay. Dad, please tell me you aren't joking. My expression grew serious. No, you are a parahuman too, I said with a resignation. I can be a hero, she half-stated, half-asked, before noticing my expression. Her cheer was dashed, making me feel awful for it. You aren't happy for me. Taylor, all I've ever wanted was for you to be happy, to become everything you could be, and to be safe. I took a deep breath. For years you've been torn with grief, not to mention the horror story that was your school life, yet I was a self-absorbed fool who didn't notice. Now, you are a cape, and I'm not sure I can keep you safe. She looked softly at me. Dad, it's fine. I know it's selfish of me, but I simply can't stand the thought of you getting hurt again, Taylor. I've failed you so much already, yet I can't keep you in a gilded cage in order to protect you from the world. It will be an even greater betrayal from my side, no matter how much I want to, I muttered. I see, Taylor whispered. Her lips curled in a gentle smile. Thank you for caring. Thank you for not treating me like a frail little thing that can't care for herself. She muttered with a faraway look in her eyes. I could see that it was her hellish experience at school that spoke right now, rekindling my fury. I vowed that I would make the life of those 3 bitches a living hell. Theirs and whoever within the Protectorate that was responsible for letting Hess do whatever she wanted. As for Principal Blackwell, I was going to bury her and her accursed school. Taylor, we have some decisions to make. She shook her head and looked at me. Basically, there are 3 ways we can go. Being independent, trying to join New Wave or the Protectorate. Each has its pros and cons. New Wave? Taylor asked in such a way I almost saw stars in her eyes. Teenagers. There is the obvious problem with them. Joining would mean revealing our identities to the world. Reporters, paparazzi, and everyone else knowing who we are. So much for being star-crossed. New, huh? Taylor shook her head. Nope. No, no way. I chuckled at her antics, glad that after everything she's been through, my daughter still could act her age. Let's see. Next, being by ourselves. No rules or paperwork. The last was a great point in my personal opinion. No one will know our names. However, we will be alone, without support, and frankly being a cape could be quite expensive. Taylor was silent for a few minutes thinking it over. Dad, you've put a lot of thought in all this. but I feel that you are giving me only the highlights. Smart girl. Last but not the least, the Protectorate. At least in theory, they might be our best option, though I do have few concerns. More than a few. Uh-huh. What do you think would be best, Dad? That once you are better, we go to have a chat with the PRT and see what proposition they make us, before making any decision. Then why tell me about the other choices right now? Being a cape is a serious job. You deserve to know our realistic options. Besides, no matter how much I wish, I can't continue treating you like a little girl forever, sweetie. =SBB=. January 15th, Vance's Restaurant. Downtown, Brockton Bay. Arranging a meeting for a consultation with Carol Dallin once I gave her a few hints about our situation proved to be surprisingly easy. What took me off guard was where we were supposed to meet. In my opinion, a restaurant wasn't an especially low-profile place. On the other hand, a lawyer meeting a client in such an establishment was something reasonably normal. To my pleasant surprise, once I entered, I was led to a secluded table in the back of the main hall of the restaurant, where Mrs. Dallin was already waiting for me, so she was either somewhere nearby or just had someone from her family bring her here. We exchanged brief pleasantries and a bit of small talk until the waiter was always with our orders. Mr. Heber, what you told me over the phone was in many ways concerning. Indeed. Just to be clear, from this moment on, we are under lawyer-client confidentiality, right? I asked after handing her a check for the agreed-upon consulting fee. Naturally. So I told her what I knew for sure about what happened to my daughter, that I strongly suspected that a ward was involved, insinuating that I've gleaned it thanks to a minor thinker power that I now had. Ah, Mr. Heber, you didn't mention that you might be a cape, my lawyer whispered. It slipped my mind, I said, and nodded towards the napkin in front of her, carefully picking it up with my telekinesis. And you believe that your daughter Taylor has triggered in the locker? Almost 100% sure. When all is said and done, you're correct. The Protectorate does have both the specialists and experience to help her cope. Being a part of the wards will allow her to mingle with her peers, which will help her heal. On the other hand, she shook her head. If one of the girls responsible for her ordeal is in there. She didn't need to finish up that sentence. Of course, I will check the facts first, but if what you said is true, Mr. Hebert, I will gladly represent you in both dealing with Winston and the Protectorate if it comes to that. Thank you. May I ask a theoretical question? I've always wondered what happens when one of the so-called independent capes bust a bunch of criminals and for once decides do help herself from some of their spoils. Money, for example. Considering that she wasn't an idiot, Carol knew exactly what and why I was asking. She gave me a disapproving frown. While technically illegal, as long as we are talking about money, from the gangs, for example, the Protectorate tends to turn a blind eye. What about the IRS? 2. Interlude 1. Armsmaster. Disclaimer: I do not own Star Wars of Worm. They belong to their respective copyright owners. This story is not created with commercial purpose. I make no money from it. If you are wondering, in the next update, Darth Danny will be telling his story about how Mr. Murphy threw his short time plans out of the airlock. The Sith of Brockton Bay. Interlude 1, Armsmaster. January 16th, PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. Armsmaster, you know that old saying, that no plan survives contact with the enemy? Heber asked. I gave him a curt nod. I shouldn't have forgotten it. Ask your questions. Let us start with the basics. How long have you been a cape, Mr. Heber? Since January 11th. I used my helmet's HUD to check the records. And news. Nothing out of the ordinary. A switch and a custom-built search engine was cross-referencing Heber's name with hospital records. There was a hit. About his daughter Taylor, brought in after some unspecified accident at school. Pretty nasty one considering what they were treating her for. I see, I said, though I really didn't. Not yet, at any rate. An accident happening to his daughter, it was unlikely to be his trigger event. Though I've seen stranger things. What were you doing at the docks this evening? A demure smile. I needed a bit of fresh air. It was a nice night for a walk. Partial lie, I frowned. I could see how someone might need to go out to clear up his head. Hell, Dragon's been on my case for weeks, insisting that I get a brief break and get out of my lab. When I'm not on official business, that is. Do you care to elaborate? A shrug. The man's lawyer shook her head. How he got Dallin to represent him was something I wanted to know. There was a story there, which might be relevant to what happened tonight. Fine for now. What happened during your walk? Those upstanding citizens, the merchants, ran into me, Mr. Hebert smiled contently. I didn't need tech to figure he was sarcastic. I was making some progress, though most people might disagree. That will be the same 25 of them. The PRT personnel recovered a click south from the location we met, I asked. I don't recall meeting any other of their kind tonight. A nonchalant shrug. Truth. Why did you attack them? To test your powers, perhaps? My client didn't attack them, Arms Master, Mrs. Dallin interjected. On them? There was a derisive snort. One of the fools must have been higher than usual because he decided that it would be fun to use me as a target practice. Another shrug. They were unlucky tonight. He was telling the truth again. Is there any specific reason why you left them all dead? Don't answer. Carol all but ordered her client. I don't particularly like drug runners, especially the kind that forcefully addict people to their shit. Mr. Hebert ignored her advice. Truth again. It didn't excuse what he did, but I can't say that I disagree. However, he didn't really admit to killing them either, though an experienced DA could twist his statement. However, a good lawyer could easily prove that it wasn't a confession either. You are aware that you just confessed to 25 counts of murder? My client said no such thing. Mrs. Dallin glared at me. Yes. Mr. Hebert contradicted her, earning a glare too. And the possible consequences? I'm not really concerned about that. Truth on both counts. Was the man unhinged by his trigger event, and what happened to his kid? What I found concerning was that while Mrs. Dallin's disapproval was obvious, she wasn't particularly concerned about her client either, or so my equipment reading her micro-expressions deduced. She either didn't care about her client and his fate, or they knew something I didn't. Perhaps they knew the same thing I did, why some capes could often get away with murder, especially if the victims were just gangsters. I can see that. The merchants weren't the only ones you encountered tonight. Yes, someone else was out for a stroll too. I felt the beginnings of a headache. A stroll. I nearly laughed. Half the bloody docks were gone. 3. Phase 1, Part 3. I'll repost this chapter when it's cleaned up. The Sith of Brockton Bay, =SBB=. Part 3, 15:45, January 15th, 2011. Vance's Restaurant, downtown, Brockton Bay. The IRS. Carol paused for a moment, thinking. That's a complicated mess. Yes, in practice, an independent cape can appropriate funds from the gangs without getting in illegal trouble. As you guessed, there is trouble if they try using those assets with their civilian identities. Up to 10 years ago, one could simply fill in such gains as an income from unspecified source on their tax forms and have a more than reasonable chance to never hear from law enforcement for their troubles. I'm guessing that's no longer the case. No, there were too many cases where parahuman criminals were easily laundering their money that way. When the IRS tried to interfere legally, well, as you can guess, it didn't end well for their agents. Nowadays, there is an entire division of the PRT working with the IRS to deal with parahumans who try to launder their money that way. While there is no need for the Protectorate's involvement if the cape doesn't reveal himself when the tax collectors come calling, well, those that do more often than not get the book and the whole library thrown at them. Plus the local Protectorate team, if that's what it takes. There must be legal ways to avoid that. Needless to say, the capes that work with or for the PRT don't have such problems. Another way is to start a company and list your civilian ID as a consultant or something, though you'll need a lot of employees to actually retain your anonymity. If you are teleporter or could fly, you might be able to get financial assets to a country with much laxer laws, create a company there, and hire your civilian ID as consultant. Though in the first case, you'd need some starting capital and a good way to funnel the money through that company without raising suspicions. The latter depends on having transport-oriented powers or the necessary contacts to get your assets out of the States. I noted. Indeed, of course, all that is, in case you are a law-abiding citizen who is all right with stretching the laws to their limits. If you are a criminal, she shrugged. Mrs. Dallin didn't need to tell me that the criminals usually had much more options. Besides, most of what she described wasn't strictly legal, more in the way of either loopholes or the authorities being willing to overlook certain things so they don't annoy the Capes too much. The situation was far from ideal, Criff. It was a god-awful mess. Just as most things on Earth bet. Though to be fair, in a lot of instances, it appeared that even 30 years later, the laws hadn't caught up with most of the changes that the presence of parahumans in the world implied. I'm surprised that the IRS isn't getting even stronger opposition from the Cape community than you imply. Well, if the IRS deliberately exposes someone's identity, there will be a hell to pay. Though they are fine if they go after the civilian persona for crimes he has committed. In almost all cases, the Cape in question has been the one to reveal themselves. A nice loophole. I'm guessing that most criminals are fine with it because it probably sends more parahumans their way than convinces people to join the Protectorate. Yes, though for that policy to actually change, Congress has to make a decision. They have been in talks on the topic for years. She shrugged. Ah, so nothing is going to come of it this decade or the next. Carol snorted. It was left unsaid that most independent Capes were in a grey area, at best, where the IRS was concerned. I was sure that they were left mostly alone unless the Protectorate needed to exert some pressure on them for one reason or another, and being able to throw their tax violations at them would help in that regard. No one said that the PRT were nice guys. Well, except their PR machine, of course. =SBB =. 1809, January 15, 2011. St. Mary's Hospital, Brockton Bay. Yes, physically Taylor's recovering very well. In a few days she'll be ready to come home, Dr. Lomax informed me. I'm sensing a but coming. Too true, Mr. Heber. On top of what one would expect from her mental trauma from her time in the locker, she is showing disturbing mood swings. From being cheerful, giddy even, to what one might expect. It's an emotional roller coaster for her, and that I find disturbing. Feeling depressed, distant, having bouts of panic. Those would be the normal reactions. The way she's been acting, I've scheduled some additional tests to check her brain chemistry for starters. I see. Oh, I did, and I wanted to start bashing my head against the wall. I would bet good money that my attempts to keep Taylor calm with the Force had unintended consequences. I should have suspected something when I saw how giddy she was after she awoke. With the sleeping medication she was on and all other crap in her system, I've forgotten the overall tech level on Earth bet was much lower than what I was accustomed to. That also applied to the medication they used here. Back home, my kids' reactions wouldn't have been out of place for someone in her condition. Here, Criffet. She was my daughter. Of course I wanted her happy. It wasn't a stretch to think that while I was using the Force to keep her calmer, I might have subconsciously forced her cheer too. Something I would have noticed if I had my head on straight, though that hasn't been the case ever since I regained my memories. Or did I dimply replace Danny and receive his? That thought gave me a headache, and I dismissed it. I used the Force to check on Taylor, who was napping. No nightmares this time, which was a relief. Damn, I needed some fresh air. =SBB =. 22:35 January 15th, 2011. Docks, Brockton Bay. After leaving the hospital, I had to deal with some mundane stuff. You know, making sure that all the bills are paid, and that was after spending a couple of hours crossing T's and dotting I's concerning Taylor's stay in the hospital and making sure that everything with my medical insurance was all right. Important, at least in the short term, but frustrating nevertheless. That's why after a trip home, shower and early dinner, I found myself out for a walk. I wandered around the city with no particular destination in mind, just enjoying a nice evening without plotting world domination or something. Not that I wanted to rule this wreck of a world. I've been in charge of planets before, and it was a massive pain in the arse. Not something most sane people who actually knew what such a position entailed would want. For all the power you would hold, more often than not, it was boring as Criff. required copious amounts of work, and you had to make nice with imbeciles you loathed. Except disposing of them would be too impractical, even if you could lawfully have them all shot without anyone baiting an eye. That's running a normal world, not a hellhole like Earthbed. My stroll led me to the docks, on the way to the Dock Workers Association's offices. I shook my head in frustration. Danny had his priorities so messed up that it wasn't even funny. When you have a Sith telling you that, you know you criffed up by the numbers. I shuddered, hoping that my theory that I was actually dumped in Danny's head was correct. It would mean that I wasn't actually responsible for being a sorry excuse of a father to go with my other faults. My headache spiked and I dismissed the thought. Where was I? The source of my headache. I was passing near a gas station where 9 things that could be loosely described as vehicles were parked. A cacophony that could rival the worst I heard in the nastiest, seediest cantinas over the galaxy was blaring from pimped-up sound systems, making some of the cars almost bounce from the sound waves. There was a small crowd amiably chatting around the vehicles, though how the hell they could hear their own thoughts I had no bloody idea. Said bunch of scum and villainy were obviously merchants. Not even in a crappy place like Brockton Bay could you see members of another gang openly smoking the Force only knows what, munching on different colored pills and shooting up their veins with substances that even an unhinged Sith Inquisitor might be reluctant to use on his victims. In plain sight at that. With a sigh, I kept walking. I wasn't looking for trouble, not this evening. "Yo, bitch," one of the merchants shouted. "Anne, this kid's is why Vale does need family and friends to keep him on the straight and narrow. Taylor being stuck in the hospital doesn't really qualify as an anchor for the time being. With that said, without her around, Darth Danny would have done so much worse, it's not even funny." Keep it cool, I kept telling myself. They weren't worth the possible trouble. It was too early for me to be revealed. It's not like a bunch of gangsters high as kites were any kind of threat. I glanced at the colourful group with contempt and went my way. There were probably working cameras around the gas station. While I had ways to neutralize them, it simply wasn't worth the bother. Besides, if they were with off-site storage, no matter how unlikely it was, I was already caught on record being in the area. I continued walking nonchalantly, paying no more attention to the gangsters. "Hey, I'm speaking to ya," one of them shouted, his voice filled with indignation. Pathetic. How the PRT and local law enforcement could leave such beings out in the streets, I had no idea. Small wonder that this city was so criffed up. I was about to cross the street and get away from the criminals when the Force tingled. It was a part warning, part anticipation. I could almost imagine the dark side smiling wickedly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Without thinking, I raised a Force shield around me, not a moment too soon. 3 cracks echoed around the docks, for a moment cutting through the awful music, trying to deafen everyone in range. A trio of fists slammed in my back, making me stumble forward. "That will teach you, bitch," shouted on of the merchants. Probably the ghost that shot me. I steadied myself and slowly turned around, trying to contain my rage. It wasn't working. I've been through too much shit lately to be able to tolerate some punk daring to shoot me in the back without overreacting. A part of me knew that I was partially at fault, that if I truly didn't want any trouble, I should have never came near the gas station once I heard the so-called music. Danny wouldn't have come anywhere close to the merchants, especially at night. General Vale, he goes where the criff he wants and expect to be shown the respect he's earned on hundreds of battlefields. Of course, no one here knew who Vale was. My anger grew. I smiled darkly at the gangsters who gaped at me. In another city, they might have thought that I was perhaps a cop wearing a vest. Not in Brockton Bay. You couldn't catch the BB's finest alone at night. Not at the docks or train yard. Here, the merchants assumed that I was a parahuman, which was good. I could feel the fear of those who weren't too drugged to feel it. It was delicious. Like the best wine you've ever tasted, though it lacked something. I know. A side dish of despair. I took a step towards the gangsters, knowing that the dark side was influencing me. Which was fine. I've learned a long time ago that in order to keep it in check, I needed to unleash it, to feed it from time to time. It made my eternal struggle much easier in the long term. Those of the merchants that still had their wits upon them stepped back. Few of them drew guns, while most were looking wildly around for a way to run. Or A. A teen who couldn't be older than 16 stuttered, waving a big-ass revolver. Or what? I asked mockingly. A wave of my hand and he was cocooned in a net of invisible energy which slammed him in the roof, sheltering the gas columns from the elements. The sound of shattering bones was a music to my ears. Guns roared and I let their bullets slam into my shield. I could have easily sent the projectiles tumbling away, but this way was better. Their fear became terror. So much better fuel for the dark side. One tried to bolt, only to shriek like a little girl when I slammed him in the side of a car, leaving a big dent in the metal. It went without saying who got the worse of that little encounter. Then I grinned maliciously, unleashing the power of the dark side upon their minds. I frowned. Only 15 were caught in the wave of insanity. I was getting rusty. While I dealt with those who tried to escape, their buddies were too busy shrieking in terror and attacking everything in sight. While amusing, watching a bunch of weak-willed drug dealers tear each other apart. It wasn't an entertainment that could keep my attention for long. There was no real challenge, and that's what the Sith warrior in me craved. Well, that part of me would have to be content with extermination of that scum, practically enslaving people with drugs. It could be said that there wasn't a group in the Bay I loathed more, with the possible exception of Coil. He at least could prove to be useful. Those. Chuffed for the furnace, I sighed and released the merchant I forced chocked to death. There were only few still alive, thrown into catatonia from the insanity I forced upon their fragile minds. A few jerky motions using telekinesis, and I granted them the final mercy, leaving 25 cooling corpses in my wake. Once I would have regretted such a butchery, felt a pang of regret. In fact, the part of my mind containing Danny was feeling sick despite the fact that he too loathed the merchants and all they stood for. It was all right. He was a nice guy, even if for the last few years sucked as a father. Danny was a decent sort. Unfortunately, in a hellhole as this, that made him soft. Unable to do what needed to be done to make a difference. It was all right. That part of me could continue to be Taylor's dad, well, most of the time. The Sith in me, well, he would to what Danny couldn't. The dark side laughed in the back of my head. She was content for now, and stopped pushing too hard once I rebuffed her sweet suggestions. Nice work, someone clapped. You spared me the need to throw away the trash. A man spoke in accented but fluent English. Deep in my thoughts, I didn't sense his approach. A mistake I could hardly afford in this world. I wasn't invincible after all. I turned to face the stranger and was grateful that my face was hidden by the shadows, so he couldn't see my shock. An Asian man stood leaning on a wall across the street. He wore sleeveless jacket, which revealed his tattooed muscled arms. His chest was bare, showing intricate dragon tattoo. If that wasn't a clue enough, he was wearing a mask that everyone in Brockton Bay would recognize. Fuck. Lung was congratulating me for a job well done. I didn't need to deal with this shit tonight. Impressive work. It's so good that I feel the need to make you a job offer, stranger. That's if you aren't one of Kaiser's groupies. Thanks, I'll pass. I'll have to insist. His nonchalant posture changed and he started walking my way. While you aren't one of my people, I can't have someone with such a talent go to the competition after all. That may prove to be troublesome. He grinned. Besides, you may prove to be a small amount of challenge. This city has been rather boring. That was the wrong thing for him to say. I was planning to stall him and get away. Fighting the fucking Lung wasn't on my to-do list anytime soon. I should leave, get away. That's what Danny's facet of my personality screamed for me to do. Instead, I returned his grin. No matter what else I was, at heart I always will be a Sith warrior. And no matter how good I had become in keeping that part of my nature in check, it came to the surface more often than I was comfortable with. Being a soldier, a general, a leader, sometimes those felt like masks I wore to hide the beast slumbering within. A worthy challenge. My grin matched Lung's. I didn't need a mirror to know my eyes bled into sickly yellow color. Oh, it's been so long since I've hunted dragons. Lung snorted with amusement and charged. The shadows around us leaped towards me as I laughed. 4. Phase 1. Part 4 Unbaited. And this part isn't baited yet. Phase 01, setting up the pieces. =SBB=. Part 4, 22:41, January 15th, 2011. Docks Brockton Bay. Have you been in such a situation before? Knowing that you are about to do is foolish, at best, yet you cannot stop yourself with going through with it anyway. Well, in my case, it's a part of my nature. A legacy of my days in the Sith Academy on Korriban, where I was reforged. I had to become a manipulative, cunning bastard in order to thrive. However, that wasn't why I survived there. That came later. The foundations to who I am today could be laid upon a single fact. I found a certain love for combat, to face a challenging foe and lay him low. In my experience, a few things in my existence could compare to that feeling. Then enter the dark side, with her affinity for conflict. With her at my side, I was reforged in the hell that was Korriban, torn down and rebuilt like countless others before me. I should have been just another brute, brash, arrogant, an expendable, blunt instrument for the Sith Lords to wield and discard on a whim, which was mostly true at the time. I struggled with my nature, a conflict I was losing until I clawed my way to the position of an apprentice of a Sith Lord. Even now, it's hard to admit to myself that it was more due to luck and the help of a slightly insane Twi'lek slave than anything else. During the years under my lady's service, I changed. I grew. I became a soldier, an officer, until finally achieving the rank of general within the Imperial military. Yet, no matter what, there was a wild, untamed part of me, which now and then surfaced and wouldn't be denied. Oh, it's been so long since I faced a worthy opponent. I knew that a confrontation with Long, win or lose, would be detrimental to my plans, that I would have to discard most of them beyond few contingencies. But I couldn't help it. No matter who or what I become, there was a brash, impulsive warrior slumbering within my heart, one who was now awake and wouldn't be denied. Worst of all, I didn't fight the need to test my mettle. I didn't even try. I wanted to face the challenge. Lung, the dragon of Kyushu, I whispered and faced his charge, even now that he had an access to a mere trickle of his power before he could ramp up. The Asian was fast, far quicker than an ordinary human had any right to be. We met in the middle of the street. He sent a good punch my way, telegraphing nothing. One moment, Lung was simply running, as if he was ready to tackle me to the ground. In the next, his right fist rocketed towards my face. I was already moving before the muscles in his arm could register the order to attack. My left hand shot up, slapping his fist away. My retaliation came next, by a way of slamming a force-enhanced fist in his solar plexus. Lung grunted, his eyes widening in pain. In the next moment, the energy around my fist exploded outward, and he was thrown back at the building across the street. That should have been it, if my opponent was a man instead of monster. Lung hit the wall with a dull thump and fell on his knees, rasping for breath. Then laughed and stood up, his muscles bulging. His skin started smoking, wisps of steam rising in the cool winter air. That's better, I said. We charged each other. Lung was faster than before. I blocked a punch, wincing as his hand slammed into mine. I almost forgot that my body wasn't up to such fun and games yet. The force roared through my veins, reinforcing both bone and mere flesh. I blocked another strike, then a third, this time barely feeling the impacts, despite everyone being stronger than the last. Ducking under the next attack, I planted another enhanced punch into his chest, only rocketing him few steps back. He grunted, feinted a punch, and tried to sweep my legs from under me. Instead, I dodged and caught him during his recovery, my foot slamming into his knee. Lung roared in pain as his joint gave away, shattering as an old, rotten branch. It took me a heartbeat to get myself stable on the ground before I telekinetically slammed my opponent in the nearest wall. He screamed again as his ruined knee was abused further. That should have been the end, crippling him unless a parahuman healer took a pity on him. At least for most parahumans. Lung, well, he was made of sterner stuff. The dragon didn't leave me disappointed. He roared again, this time in pure, undiluted, tasty rage. Fascinating, I whispered. Lung's hands changed into misshapen clawed paws. His skin became leathery, not dissimilar from a Trandossian's hide. Armored plates formed on his chest. His ruined knee snapped with the sound of bone grating on more of itself, before reformed into armor-covered joint which tore through the leg of his pants. "I make you suffer," Lung growled, dark smoke billowing from the corners of his mouth. Razor-sharp claws swiped my way faster than a pissed-off rattlesnake. I jumped back just in time and stole a glance at my chest. My jacket and shirt were cut as if by laser. Before I could land back on my feet, the dragon was upon me, his hands a blur. I threw a telekinetic wave his way, slowing him enough so I regained my footing. Just in time, too, because a second later he was back. His claws tore through the air, barely missing my face as I ducked. Lung's other hand tried to gut me, but I caught his scaly wrist, my enhanced muscles a match for his inhuman strength. I grabbed his other hand as he tried to wreck my face, and we stared at each other. My muscles bulged as he tried to simply overpower me. His strength was raising by the moment, something the leader of the ABB was well aware of. He gave me a grin filled with too many long, sharp teeth to be mistaken for a human one. I could see an inferno burning in his reptilian eyes. I smirked and kicked him with all my strength. Wouldn't you know there weren't any armor plates covering his groin? The power of my kick was enough to raise his bulk few centimeters off the ground. Lung's eyes almost exploded out of his skull. His deformed muzzle formed a surprised O before he roared in pain. The sheer volume of the sound threw me back. I was sure that if it wasn't for me shielding with the force, his scream would have caused some internal injuries. As it was, I landed lightly on me feet and chuckled at the doubled-over monstrosity. Hearing a half-man, half-dragon whimper while clutching his family jewels was bloody hilarious. Lung roared, shattering windows for blocks away. His back bulged, the flesh ripping apart to reveal two leathery wings. His limbs grew, becoming like the trunks of elder trees. His torso followed until the dragon looked like his namesake. In seconds, the enraged beast had grown to be a bit bigger than a van. He glared at me and opened his maw. The force tingled with warnings of danger just as he sent a jet of orange flame straight at me. I acted on instinct, my left arm snapping up and guiding the force as I've done countless times before. The liquid fire changed its trajectory and lit up the street. Meanwhile, I telekinetically grabbed a lamppost and heaved, tearing it from the ground and the power lines it was attached to it. Lung stopped pretending to be a flamethrower when one of his eyes caught sight of what I just did. I could see him readying himself to spring at me, his scales rippling as his muscles tensed, ready for action. I was faster. I hit him in the side of the skull, snapping his head to the left. A clang echoed over the docks as if I just hit a giant gong. Then another when I repeated my attack on the other side of his head. Before he could recover, I delivered an overhead strike, hard enough to bend the metal lamppost. Lung's head slammed in the ground, cracking the asphalt. For few seconds he laid there stunned. "Come on, that can't be all you've got," I exclaimed. I wanted a real fight, not some light practice, criff it all. Lung apparently heard me and agreed. His eyes focused on me. He growled, his claws gorging the ground. He grew, his scales hardening, then glowing. The dragon arose, spreading his wings, which were starting to smoke. Now Lung was 6 meters tall, fire-breathing lizard. I smiled, drawing more of the force. I jumped back, vaulting over the gas station to land on the concrete dome covering the gas columns. I waved of my hand for better control, and a pickup truck flew at the dragon, who was caught off guard by my move. He actually caught my improvised projectile in his paws. Lung studied it for a moment and returned it with a vengeance, sending a stream of fire right behind it. I countered with a telekinetic wave, which bounced the truck back and dispersed the flames in an arch that lit up the sky for blocks. That either caught him off guard, or Lung was simply temporarily blinded by his own flames because the car slammed into his chest with the sound of tortured metal. The fuel tank ruptured, bathing the dragon with gasoline. The fuel was promptly ignited when it came into contact with a part of the truck that was set on fire. A subdued explosion wrecked what was left of the pickup and rocked Lung back. An indignant roar later, and he lunged my way. I smirked and sprinted forward. The moment my legs reached the end of the concrete, I vaulted forward, shooting over the street. Rotating mid-flight, I sent an overpowered push at the serpent, who was passing underneath me. He slammed in the ground, digging deep furrows in the street. It didn't really slow him down. By the time I had reached the building across the street, ran up its wall and jumped on the roof, Lung had recovered and was thundering my way. For a moment, I thought that he would try to either fly or climb to get me. Instead, the dragon decided to be more direct. He breathed a jet of fire at the building's facade, then plowed straight through. The roof shook under my legs. I could feel him setting the building on fire from the inside while tearing the floors separating us. The force screamed a warning, and I decided that it would be prudent if I was somewhere else. So I sprinted and jumped on the nearby warehouse just in time to see the roof where I was standing explode with white-hot flames. The building crumbled, revealing a 10 meters tall lizard. Lung roared his defiance at the skies before looking my way. My heart thundered with excitement. This was it, what I've been craving for more than a decade. Another angry blow and the dragon darted my way. I jumped out of his path, sparks dancing around my right hand. I took a second to aim and unleashed a lightning strike at his side. The overgrown lizard rocked, electricity arching upon his scales. This time his roar was one of pain. He twisted in mid-air, his wings snapped to arrest his path. Lung changed his direction and flew my way. I dodged again, his bulk slamming through the roof of a mini-market. Before he could arrest his momentum and turn my way, the whole building was a write-off. I used the momentary distraction to tear away another lamppost and throw it at Lung as a giant lance. The dragon slapped away my improvised projectile and tried to torch me on the spot. I sprinted away, a wave of roaring fire following in my wake. Using my telekinesis, I tore a door of its hinges and darted inside the nearest building. The more reasonable part of my brain was coming back online, and I was starting to think that facing Lung of all things, without a plan, wasn't my brightest idea. I haven't had such fun ever since my wife passed away. I would find a way to put this lizard down. But first, I needed to get out of here. The building around me, a convenience store, was disintegrating under a sustained dragon fire. I burst through an emergency exit at the back, flames licking on my feet. My eyes darted around until I saw a construction site few blocks away. I smiled. Lung waged through the burning store only to receive another lighting blast for his troubles. He bellowed indignantly and sped after me. The moment his front legs stepped on the street outside, I swept them from under him using another lamppost. He fell to the ground, and I did his best to bash his brains in, only to find out that now his head was much harder. After the fourth hit, the pole was twisted into uselessness. Lung only shook his head and glared at me. I sprinted towards the construction site, taking a shortcut by jumping from building to building. I could hear sirens and screams in the distance, only now remembering that we were in the mostly abandoned industrial part of the district. If I had chosen another way to run, by now we would have been fighting amidst a residential area. The outcome of such a stunt would have cut my future options tremendously. Not that they weren't already limited. Lung tried to fry my ass, coming uncomfortably close. That focused my mind on the here and now. I didn't need to look behind to see that he was flying after me and torching the buildings I was jumping across. I looked over the roofs, finding the clutter pretty useless. There were few old air conditions here and there. With barely a thought, they shot at Lung. He swept one out of his way, but the other three struck him in the side with enough force to fly apart and nearly make him crash. That distraction bought me enough time to reach the construction site. It was centered around the steel and concrete skeleton of a 10-story building, which I used as a vantage point. I idly noted a sign proudly announcing that this was a Fortress Industries project. I smiled when I saw what I had to work with: steel rod and cables, robust construction equipment that would make a decent battering ram. Lung was seconds away, diving at me like a bomber which had acquired a juicy target. He spat another wave of flame at me, but this time I stood my ground. The main reason why I ran for a time was simple. When I fist-faced him, I was high on battle lust, letting my warrior heart cloud my judgment. I wasn't in a physically younger body at its peak. Neither was I wearing the power armor I had grown accustomed to. Right now, I was in Danny's body, and no matter how much I enhanced it with the Force, it was far cry to what I was used to. It wasn't what the warrior in me had subconsciously counted on when I chose to challenge Long, instead of taking him out immediately or disabling him for few moments and slipping into the night. It didn't matter. I simply couldn't back down now. My pride wouldn't allow it. "Enough games, little lizard," I growled. The flying flamethrower glared at me as if it heard me. In the next moment, he grunted in pain when I sent a big cargo truck in his gut. He was thrown high in the air. Before the dragon could recover and stabilize his flight, I grabbed him with the force and slammed him in the ground. The sickening sound of shattering bones echoed around me. I was far from over. Waving my hand so I could better control it, I used steel wire to tie up the wounded dragon. It was futile. He roared in agony, his scaled hide twisting every which was as his bones realigned, snapped in place and regrew. His body shuddered as if made of rubber, and he grew again, becoming nearly as tall as the building I was standing upon. For a moment I wondered if I had bit more than I could chew, but immediately disregarded that thought. I was the Dark Lord of the Sith. I wouldn't be bested by some overgrown excuse for a crate dragon. The flight and fire breathing notwithstanding. The wire snapped as if made of cotton, breaking in places, melting in others as Lung became hotter than a furnace. His whole body was becoming to glow red, his wings smoking like an old factory's chimney. I raised a hand, steel rods following my direction. The first struck Lung like a cannon shot, only to bounce from his armored chest. The second hit his right wing, skewering the much softer tissue there. The dragon roared and tried to lunge at me, only to find invisible wall between us. A steel javelin impaled his other wing, distracting him for a second. I used that time to concentrate on the dozen steel rods I was levitating. Purple lighting exploded from my fingers, arching from rod to rod. They glowed white, ready to melt, however I used the force to keep them in the same shape. Lung breathed out more fire, creating a wall and inferno between us. My shield held for now. I didn't know if he was simply enraged and trying to overwhelm me, or simply making sure that I couldn't see him clearly and aim for possible weak spots. I smirked, as if I needed to use my eyes to aim. I snapped my hand down, and the glowing rods flew towards him in unison, dark lighting arching between each of them. Lances made of the force itself slammed into Lung's scales with the power of a rail cannon. He rocketed back, as if hit by a Hod's hammer. I smiled maliciously at the dragon. 7 of my improvised spears had penetrated deep into his flesh. With a though, I released the energy enveloping the now molten metal. Lungs roared like a tortured soul. I grinned. Apparently even a fire-breathing lizard felt it when liquid metal sears his insides. It was time to make it even worse. I concentrated, channeling the force to my hands, and pointed at Lung. A torrent made of lighting struck him, searching the metal within the dragon and arching through it, searing his organs. Lung spasmed, his agonized roar becoming weaker and weaker. I used the lighting to pick up his body and slam it in the ground for a good measure. Lung laid still. I grinned before falling to my knees, panting for breath. That stunt took a lot of me. Hot air and ashes stung my throat, making me cough. Winds whipped around me, born of air currents disturbed by the energy released during the battle. One I just won. Something shifted, like metal scrapping through rubble. I glared towards Lung. The dragon had raised his head, his reptilian eyes staring at me. His maw stretched, revealing rows of very sharp teeth. He was smiling. Lung's scales glowed bright red, his wings flapped and ignited, merry flames dancing down their whole width. "That's bullshit," I muttered. His glow intensified. The force screamed a warning. I jumped back as far away as I could. In the same time, I was gathering as much of the force as I could, using it to reinforce a shield I was creating between me and Lung. The world went white. I felt searing pain before a giant's fist slammed into me. Sometimes later, I cracked open an eye. My ears were ringing. Everything hurt. Groaning, I grabbed the force, using it to soothe my aches. I knew this feeling well enough. It wasn't the first time I've been on the wrong side of an artillery barrage. That thought sobered me when I remembered where I was. My face twisted in a hateful grimace. I was half bird in rubble, my leg was broken, and the less said about the burns on my front, the better. I glanced at my chest, seeing shadows disperse to reveal red, oozing flesh. "Lung," I hissed. Touching the soothing coolness of the light side, I used it to mend my wounds. A broken leg mended, though it would be some time before the bone was in as good as new. The cracks in my ribs sealed, as well as some internal bleeding. The first and second degree burns on my front sealed, leaving behind angry, half-healed scars and tenderized flesh. Something that I would have to deal with later. I had unfinished business. I blasted the rubble half covering my body away and stood up. The sight that greeted me was a familiar one, burning ruins for as far as my eyes could see. Like a city suffered from extended artillery barrage or a light orbital strike. All thanks to Lung. Even one such as I couldn't help but be impressed at his feat. My eyes hardened. It wouldn't help me. As if hearing my thoughts, something shifted in the smoke. A massive, adorning, impossibly long neck appeared through the haze. I could clearly see its surprise as it laid its eyes upon me. I channeled electricity in the palm of my right hand, compressed it upon itself until it became plasma. Then I extended and shaped it, forging it into a dark blue, almost purple blade. Now and then small bolts of electricity arched from it, giving me an eldritch appearance. "Ready for round two?" I growled. The shadows around me came alive as I charged. Lung roared and came to meet me. The force grew heavy upon me as I overcharged myself, not only using it as a physical shield, but also making myself far stronger and faster than a human had any right to be. Then I jumped straight at him and grinned as the beast tried to snatch me with one of his paws. I sent a continuous stream of lighting at his clawed appendage, using it to change my direction mid-flight. My body protested the abuse I was putting it through, but I ignored it. Lung twisted his long neck, his head shooting straight at me, attempting to end me with a single bite. My counter was simple. I channeled power through my makeshift blade, blasting his muzzle with a blinding bolt of lighting. The sheer kinetic energy of the strike snapped his head up, and I changed direction once again. His left paw swiped blindly in my direction. I twisted in the air, barely missing his talons, and landed just behind his scaly wrist. First, Lung tried to gnarl on me again, only to receive another shock straight at his maw. His next attempt was marginally more successful. He tried to throw me away by shaking his hand. Instead of trying to keep my balance, I dropped down, slamming my blade into his flesh. As it turned out, the dragon's hide and scales weren't a match for Plasma Blade. Me makeshift weapon sunk down to the hilt, and I manipulated it, making it more solid so it could actually bear my weight as Lung tried to shake me away. He roared in pain as the sting in his wrist sent lighting through his nervous system and attempted to grab me with his other paw. Just what I was waiting for. I jumped, passing centimeters over his claws, and landed upon his other arm. Wasting no time, I sprinted up his appendage, while constantly channeling lighting at his head, keeping it away from me. Then Lung surprised me, flexing his flame-covered wing and swiping its edge straight at me. I was barely able to jump over it, landing hard on his shoulder. Pain exploded in my side. "Criff it all!" I grunted and tried to get myself off the spike that impaled me. Lung shook, making my wood even worse. I felt something tearing and roared in pain. Moment later, I found myself tumbling through the air, Lung's head dashing my way. I somehow managed to move my limbs so I resembled a ball just before the dragon was ready to swallow me in single bite. As his jaws were about to snap around me, I expelled as much force energy from my body as I could, in the form of single telekinetic blast. Next thing I knew was the sudden impact with the ground. I bounced, acutely feeling bones crack, and tumbled to a standstill. I stood there dazzled, trying my best to regain my senses. I blinked and looked at the monster. Lung roared, sounding wrong. His lower jaw was hanging useless. He stumbled, bellowing again. That was good. He wasn't immediately attacking, giving me time to do a little patch job on my wounds. Fist, I stopped the bleeding in my side, then collapsed my left lung, which was filling with blood. That would have to do for now, I thought while mending my bones. I grunted, trying to stand up. Every breath was agony. With every movement, my muscles screamed in flames. Lung shook his head a few times, his jaw snapping back in place. The dragon carefully moved it left and right until he was satisfied that it was working fine again. Then he turned his attention back to me. I glared at the beast. "It's time to end this," I spat. I used every bit of fury, every stab of pain, every shred of hatred that I felt for that lizard who came so close to ending me. My eyes blazed with yellow, poisonous light. I channeled all the fear I felt for Taylor if she was left in this world alone again, and went beyond it. The dark side pulsed around me, a mass of living darkness bubbling all around. More power than most Sith would taste during their entire lives, and I went beyond. I forced myself to remember every being I've ever hated, every enemy I've faced, feeding the dark side even further. I could hear her delighted laughter at the feast I was offering. Yet she wanted more. A whole new world to consume, one previous untouched by her predations. Oh, it would be so easy to unleash her, to end my pain. So easy. I shook my head and glared at the black mass surrounding me. She was mine to rule, not the other way around. My hands clawed at the darkness as I forced it to submit to my will. The temptress simply laughed. "The next time," she whispered. I ripped away the cloak of darkness that had cocooned me, molding it into a lace darker than the abyss between the stars. Lung roared, a jet of plasma came at me, burning everything in its way. I raised my free hand, stopping it in its tracks. "Die!" I roared, and threw the black lance straight at his heart. The dragon shifted, trying to get his fire around the invisible wall, stopping it. The lance, made from the pure essence of the dark side, passed through his scales as if they weren't there and burrowed deep within his chest. Second later, its corrupting energies started to dissolve him from the inside. This time, his agonizing roar shook the whole city as his insane regeneration was fighting to restore his organs. I grinned like a madman. It was time to end it. That lance and me, we were connected by a thread. I was feeding it energy to continue wrecking Lung. However, my reserves were almost gone. I raised a hand, channeling the last vestiges of my power through the link. It went into Lung, clawed into his very life force, and came streaming back through the link like a torrent that wouldn't be denied. First, I felt soothing warmth spreading through my fingers, chasing the pain away. I glanced at my hand and saw the half-healed burns melt like snow under midsummer's sun. I could feel barely mended bones mend, becoming as good as new. The burning in my muscles slowly dissipated, and I breathed a sigh of relief once my lung was back to normal. The lance in Lung's guts shifted, losing coherence. The river of energy surging into me dried up, and the connection was severed. The dragon stood still for a moment, as if wondering what was happening. One moment he was there, appearing to be whole, as if ready to amp up once again. Lung shuddered. The right side of his torso, the area I spared him, caved in. Then half his chest blew away in wave of darkness, eating everything in its way. His right wing and part of his back were thrown up and slowly tumbled through the air. For a long moment, Lung stared at me in shock, then his upper half slid over the mangled ruin that used to be his torso and toppled to the ground. "What the hell?" someone muttered to my right. I glanced that way, only to see a familiar figure clad in power armor. I chuckled before crumbling to my knees. The force slipped through my exhausted fingers. All I could do was to use the last vestiges of stolen power to keep myself conscious. 5. Phase 2, Parts 1 and 2. The Sith of Brockton Bay. Phase 02, Entering the Stage. == SBB=. Part 1. 2:27, January 16th, 2011. PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. Was it something I said? Carol Dallon was examining me as if I had suddenly grown another head, while Armsmaster simply stared at me. Before one of them could answer me, the door opened and an overweight woman in her mid-40s dragged herself in the interrogation room. Her face was fixed into a cold grimace, determination shining in her eyes. I didn't need the force to feel her feeling. Right now she was rather riled up and pissed off with me. "So let me get this straight, Mr. Hebert. You admitted that you murdered 25 people and then went against Lung, causing a great amount of damage to my city. Only God knows how many were killed or wounded during your stroll." She gave me an impressive sneer. "Ah, self-defense?" Carol half stated, half asked. Something in my story had disturbed her, and she was off her game right now. Bullshit, your client went out searching for trouble. Not this time, though I did finish it, I quipped. The woman, who still hasn't introduced herself, glared at me. Not that an introduction was really necessary. After all, it wasn't hard to recognize the director of the local PRT. She's been on the job for the last decade, with often appearances on the TV and newspapers. Give me one good reason not to have you charged with multiple counts of murder and anything else we could think of. Her glare intensified. I gave her a cold smile. Ever since the engagement with Lung ended, I've been thinking. During that battle, I plunged deeper in the depths of the dark side than I've done in a long, long time. The strain of using such amount of energy, it was burning parts of me, mind and body. In the same time, I used both the energies of the light side and some of what I stole from Lung to repair most of the damage. As it was, it would be few weeks until I could cut loose again. That was the bad news. The good one was that swimming so deep in the Force helped clean my head. And the worst news was that someone or something had messed with it in the first place. And I didn't meant the bender of getting my memories back and integrating them with Danny's. Ever since the battle ended, I've been splitting my attention between telling my side of the story and doing my best to reinforce my mental shields. While I didn't know yet what exactly was done to me, I could extrapolate some things. Meeting the merchants, then Lung tonight, wasn't an accident. While that ancient saying that there are no coincidences, only the Force is often true, I doubted that the Force was responsible for this mess. It was a setup, a test. Which begged the question, who knew that I had powers? My first thought was that I somehow fucked up during my previous encounter with the merchants. Or perhaps my esteemed lawyer spoke about me with the wrong person. Still, engineering my meeting with Lung... Criff. I felt like slamming my head in the table, repeatedly. I've almost forgot exactly where I was. Earth fucking Bet, home of a metric ton of precogs. Which begged the question on how their powers worked, seeing possible futures as I could. Some kind of number crunching, extrapolating the possibilities. I almost immediately discarded the second option. If it was true, I should have been invisible beyond being the ordinary Danny Hebert. There was something I was missing. I submerged myself in the Force, ignoring Director Pigot's insistence that I answered. My whole body lit up with pain, as if I had just ignited myself. The pain was intense, but irrelevant. Gritting my teeth and ignoring it, I forced myself to remember. It's been few centuries since I was on my Earth. The memories from that time were faded, mostly forgotten. That wasn't a problem for the Force. Bit by bit, pieces of my past surged to the forefront of my mind. I ruthlessly snuffed the pangs of nostalgia which came with those memories and concentrated on my search. As I should have done once I finished integrating Danny's memories. I winced. There was information to be retrieved. Could I trust it was the question? I didn't know if I was in the cannon worm, with my emergence being the only difference, before I started making swarms of butterflies, but I simply didn't know which of my memories were actually from the original book or parts of fan stories I've read. Even the Force couldn't give me a perfect recall for things I've experienced before knowing it. It clicked. Powers, shards, connections, thinking if perhaps not sentient. A way for the local precogs to know what I was doing now, if not what I would do long term. Well, I had to do something about that. Mr. Heber, Danny, are you all right? Carol was shaking my shoulder, looking at me with some concern. I blinked, coming back to the real world. I looked around to see that the director had backed near the door, while Armsmaster had come between us and had his halberd unfolded. Let's say I just had an epiphany. What do you know about the way gaining powers affects one's brain? =SBB Part 2, 231, January 16th, 2011. PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. I fucked up, by the numbers. Granted, if my suspicions were right, I had some help along the way. However, that was something that I needed to address away from prying eyes. Preferably soon. I glanced at my gracious hosts. Armsmaster still hovered protectively in front of the director, who in turn was glaring at me. To my right, Mrs. Dallin was giving me concerned look. At least she hasn't overreacted and called up her powers. Yet. Answer the question, please. Pigot's glare intensified for a moment, but then she shook her head. usually minor, in comparison to the trigger effect itself, unless you are a tinker or thinker. She glanced at Armsmaster, but the expression on her face didn't change. How interesting, I deadpanned. Not so in my case. My abilities came with some baggage. Good enough to justify what you did. The director's glare went up a notch. That and what I'm about to do in the future. I smiled cheerfully at them. Besides, what exactly did I do? Yes, I faced 25 goddamned gangsters who decided that it was a good idea to shoot a pedestrian who was minding his own business. Members of one of the villain-led gangs in your city. Then, once I defended myself successfully, another one, villainous Cape, who should have been dealt with a long time ago, decided that I must either join his damned gang or die. I glared at the director. If you had done your damned job, nothing would have happened tonight. I would have had a calm, peaceful walk, and the docks would be intact. The other occupants in the room stiffened. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, reining in my power. The question you should be asking me, Director, is what you should be doing to keep me on the side of the angels. Oh, not as a member of the Protectorate, if what's been happening lately is anything to go by. Why the hell I would want to be a part of an incompetent organization? Why would we want a mass murderer on our side? Pigot's eyes narrowed at me. Her voice was level, professional, just as her posture. Her earlier outburst had been mostly a performance for my benefit, though I could clearly feel her feelings towards me. She was wary, yet despised what I had done while taking down Long. Yep. Wrecking a part of her city would do that. Well, the other recourse is that you or some overzealous idiot in the DA office tries to put me on trial and then railroad me. As an example, because your PR is suffering. Again, such an act would have unpleasant consequences for everyone. I spoke in such a tone that left no doubt that it wouldn't be unpleasant for me. Armsmaster's bearded face twisted in a mighty frown. Ah, his fabled truth detector. It was telling him that I was saying the truth from my point of view. Mr. Hebert, you should choose your words carefully. This was Carol. Though I can't say that I disagree with most of what you said. She glared at Armsmaster and Pigot. No matter how you try to spin it, my client was attacked. Once by villain henchmen and the other by Lung himself. Last time I checked, it was your job to prevent something like that from happening. It was Lung, Pigot exclaimed. You know very well what happened the last time we tried to take him down. Armsmaster has created some countermeasures after that debacle, but we never had a chance to try them. How predictable. Placed them in a bad light, and they went straight to arse-covering mode. Now I expected another round of threats of trials and imprisonment if I didn't retain the initiative. Mrs. Dallin, the main reason I called you tonight is to check any paperwork in case I and the good folks from the PRT reach an agreement. If we don't... I trailed off, changing the subject. I knew I almost made making another mistake. If I hadn't bolstered my mental shields to the point it made my head hurt, I would be even more unstable right now. There was a part of me that was determined that no way in hell I was going to play by the locals' rules. Perhaps it was all the decades I've spent as the power behind the throne of a galactic government. But the very thought that I could be prosecuted for taking out a loose cannon like Lung, no matter the tiny bit of collateral damage, was absurd. Laughable even. On the other hand, the part of me that was Danny was horrified. This was the Protectorate that I was contemplating going against, unless they didn't see reason. Pure, sheer madness. Unless you was one of the big hitters, an S-class threat that was too dangerous to provoke, yet could be useful. Someone like Lung, a monster able to go toe-to-toe with Leviathan. Well, I took down the bastard, didn't I? Danny's spectre shut up at that thought. Let me get this straight. You murdered 25 people in cold blood, countless others during your engagement with Lung, and now expect to make a deal with us. Probably get off the hook altogether. The director was looking at me as if I was losing it. I killed 25 members of the merchants, in self-defense all the while my power was acting up. I beamed at her. For all of 2 seconds. Then I forced all the cheer, all humanity off my face. That's the situation, Director. I was forced to kill because gangsters in your city believed that they could simply shoot people in the streets, for fun. As for Lung, it's all on you two. I pointed at the pair. I have no idea why you decided not to call in help and dispose of that menace. I shook my head in exasperation. Now, while we are on the topic of your failures, let me ask you, Emma Barnes, Madison Clemens, Sophia Hess. Even without the force I would have saw it easily, the way Pigot's eyes tightened when I mentioned Hess. I see, I hissed. That explains so much. I glared at them. There are only 2 female wards in this city at this time, Vista, who is too young, and Shadow Stalker. Mr. Hebert, I don't know what you are. Enough! I slammed a fist into the table, denting it. Suddenly, I could sense the shadows in the room. They moved as if alive, coiling protectively around me. Armsmaster raised his halberd, but wasn't ready yet to attack. So it was one of your bloody wards and her accomplices that put my daughter in the hospital. Hess, Armsmaster spat the name. What are you doing? Pigot railed on him. He knows. The hero nodded at me. The director took a deep breath and stopped to think for a moment. I patted myself on the back. Riling up government official was the same even dimension away. There are laws against exposing the identity of a ward. I'm aware of that. Mrs. Dallin was very helpful in that regard. I nodded at my lawyer. That changes nothing. The question still stands. Why would I even consider working with you given the circumstances? As for charging me for what happened tonight, go ahead. I'm ready to take my chances. You folks apparently live and die by the PR. Let's see how a trial affects it. 6. Interlude. Various. Interlude. Contessa =. 1:44, January 16th, 2011, Cauldron HQ. Location unknown. You called urgently, Alexandra said when she stepped through the portal. I miscalculated. Right now there is no path to victory. Ah. The woman, known also as Costa Brown, was lost for words. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I'll make an educated guess. It has something to do with Brockton Bay and the little test you decided to run there. Contessa nodded. Something changed. A few of our precogs could feel it. I did too. She bit her lip, shuddering. That thing, it was still here. She could sense it like a boundless ocean just beyond her touch. In the last hour, there were times she could almost hear a voice, a whisper in the dark. When Contessa concentrated on it, she felt cold, which no matter how warm the room around her was, didn't go away. It was at that time all paths to the future she had been supervising simply vanished. Any new she tried to craft simply fell apart. When Contessa tried to trace her steps back to see where it all went wrong, she shuddered again, feeling unnatural chill spreading through her. Can you explain to me in small, clear words why a significant part of a city district is leveled? While you are at it, please tell me why Director Pigot believes that Lung died while confronting a new cape. About him, Dr. Mother added, stepping through another portal. The little lizard is still alive. I have him in medical, but it's not clear yet if he'll survive. Alexandra crashed onto a nearby chair. Anything else you want to share? She glared at Contessa. The plan should have worked. She shrugged. It did, I think. Please explain that, Alexandra ordered in a no-nonsense voice. It was simple. Just a few steps. All it took was a couple of calls and the board was set up. Then one of our assets subtly manipulated the merchants and Lung, making sure that they will be aggressive. That much is obvious, Dr. Mother quipped. She apparently enjoyed the situation. What went wrong? Technically nothing. The plan worked. Perfectly at that. I'm not going to like this at all, am I? Alexandra groaned. Oh, we have the information, all right. That's why I called you. Where are the numbers man and Eidolon? The former is in medical with a killer headache, and the later is apparently busy and will be coming in later, Contessa answered. She heard a sultry laughter in the back of her head. You are stalling. Alexandra narrowed her eyes. Yep. I need a drink. Start spilling the beans. Unless something changes, we have about 6 months. Run that by me again. Alexandria was up on her feet in an instant. You heard me. Either Scion on our new friend will cause or set in motion an extinction-level event within half a year. Okay, kill that man and we'll plan on dealing with our old friend. Dr. Mother said after thinking about it for a moment. If Mr. Hebert dies, we have 2 months at best. The fuck did you do tonight? Alexandria growled. $SBB Scion high orbit, Earth bet. The being that the humans knew as Scion floated high above the azure and emerald sphere that was their cradle. Despite what some thought, he wasn't really dumb, simply lacked experience or interest in dealing with anything that didn't fall within his sphere of responsibility. Once her mate got herself killed, he was without direction, no purpose. So Scion, whose true name couldn't be pronounced nor comprehended by a human, started the first phase of the usual plan. Then he found himself drifting without a purpose. It would have been nearly a century before the next phase should have began. Without his mate, he simply existed, wandering the world below, until he met one of those tiny beings who actually could be understood if barely. Probably thanks to that malfunctioning interpreter shard connected to the man. That's how Scion found himself with a hobby to pass the years. Being a hero, it was even entertaining from time to time. Until this evening, he stared down with senses transcending the dimension themselves. The world below him was different. There was an energy field engulfing it, one that he didn't recongize, a power which actively avoided being analyzed. Scion stiffened. He heard a laughter, so similar to his mate's yet different. He looked around, scanning for all he was worth, but finding nothing. He was alone in orbit. Scion glanced down and frowned. The energy field was spreading out fast. At that rate, it would engulf the inner system soon. Curious at the phenomenon, he used his projection to touch, sample the energy. It was strange, both warm and cold, one moment serene, flowing calmly. In the next, it was all rage, resembling the heart of a solar storm. It was bitter. It was sweet. He heard a whisper, but the meaning was lost on the solar winds. Scion moved closer to the planet and bathed in the new power source, though a way to utilize this energy escaped him. For now, he almost heard a teasing laughter. Almost. $SBB Emily Pigot $232, January 16, 2011. PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. Director Pigot looked warily at the man across the table. Suddenly he had spaced out, shadows gathering around him. She had promptly moved away, while Armsmaster had slipped between her and the possible threat. However, Danny Hebert simply stared into space as if none of them was ever there. She frowned at the latest utter mess made by parahumans. Significant part of the docks were gone, with more on the way to oblivion as the fire department and some heroes were fighting out of control fires. Hundreds were either dead, wounded or missing, all thanks to people with powers. And because her hands were tied in dealing with the most powerful parahuman in her city. Lung, who should have been dealt with one way or another after he took on her whole protectorate team and won. Handily. However, Pigot's call for outside assistance remained unanswered, with the excuse that another confrontation would simply invite huge collateral damages, no matter the outcome. And now Mr. Hebert was throwing the same arguments she had made to Director Costa Brown back at her. Emily glared at the person of interest. The points he made stung, because he was right and she had been prevented from solving the problem. It would have been so easy. A child's play, either a regular sniper from the PRT or Miss Militia, using anti-material rifle, could have ended Lung in a heartbeat. Instead, he was left alone, never to be chased too hard or openly confronted. A tickling time bomb until he faced either a newly triggered cape or one out of town, who the Dragon of Kyushu couldn't take Dawn without ramping up. And it finally happened, with predictable results. But of course, her situation was even worse. From what little she saw of Mr. Hebert, he was now a broken man, just like every other parahuman on the planet. Unfortunately, he wasn't an idiot. He knew the position he was in. Mr. Hebert was well aware that he could easily be charged with multiple counts of murder and manslaughter, not to mention being accountable for what happened in the docks. That much was true. Now making those charges stick and getting to trial. That was possible, with the right judge probable even. Despite Danny Hebert being a pillar of the community with a snow-white record until last night's events. The points he made after getting out of his trance were spot on, unfortunately. If a prosecutor decided to touch a case against Mr. Hebert with a 10-foot pole, there was no guarantee that a jury would convict him. Far from it. Lung was one of the Brockton Bay's boogeymen. Even worse, the same issues Mr. Hebert had just raised had been already asked by both politicians and reporters. Lung was infamous the world over, after all. And the truth, one she was painfully aware of, was hard and ugly. Lung was getting a free pass because he was strong enough to fight an endbringer to a standstill, no matter the little inconvenient fact that he might very well refuse to face another ever. It wasn't like Lung had gotten out of his way to do so. He hasn't been present for any of the subsequent attacks. It was questionable if he would have fought if her city was struck. Yet Pigot's hands were tied. Lung was to be left alone unless he went on a rampage. Now she had to clean up, said the consequences, and had another dangerous parahuman on her hands. At least by all accounts, Lung wasn't going to be a problem ever again, which left her with the Danny Hebert problem. To someone unfamiliar with the Protectorate's inner workings, her job would be obvious. Interrogate him, and if there was enough evidence of wrongdoing, arrest him, letting the courts deal with him. If only it was that simple. The truth, not that she particularly liked it, was different. The Protectorate, in fact, existed to help parahumans who found themselves in Mr. Hebert's place, as well as dealing with clear and present threat of the superpowered kind. While that man was dangerous, no kidding, was he a threat? The only thing she had against him, besides being a parahuman and thus not to be trusted by default, was an admission of killing merchants in what amounted to self-defense, and not regretting it. Though she had to admit that anyone who had to deal with that gang wouldn't shed any tears over what he had done. Hell, any reasonable jury from the vicinity of Brockton Bay was more likely to give the man a medal if he was charged with killing a bunch of those particular gangsters. After they shot him in the back, no less. What she might make stick was holding Hebert partially responsible for all the collateral damage in his fight with Lung. In theory. In practice, such an attempt was going to be shot from her boss, Costa Brown. Oh, doing so was viable and legal. The practical consequences, of course, would see her career over and the Protectorate screwed in the long term. All because of parahumans. Danny Hebert had been defending himself from attack. By the goddamned Lung of all people. Prosecuting him for that would destroy the Protectorate's credibility with most parahumans, sending the wrong message. That they are screwed if they are forced to use their powers in self-defense. And the gangs would love for her to make such a mistake, because that would drive many capes either in their hands or at least away from the Protectorate. Pigot frowned, wondering how to solve that mess. The obvious out was clear. Get Mr. Hebert to sign in with the Protectorate and all this could be made to go away. Then he had to throw his little bombshell. The reason why he had triggered and why his daughter was currently in the hospital. Damn Shadow Stalker and her stunts to hell. And damn Winslow for saying that everything had been great as far as Sophia Hess's conduct had been concerned. Pigot glared at Mr. Hebert. The cheeky bastard was actually smiling now, daring her to arrest him and call the district attorney's office. He knew, damn him too. It didn't really matter if he would be sentenced or not. To almost everyone would seem that they are placing him on trial for defending himself, and with Lung involved and almost certainly dead as a result of that fiasco, there was no hope in hell from keeping the media away. Even if the Protectorate's PR team manages to paint Mr. Hebert as a villain, which was uncertain to stick, they would likely be screwed anyway. If, she almost laughed, wondering how she was stuck in such position. There wasn't an easy or simple solution to her problem. Her next choice hanged on one simple question. What was Danny Hebert going to do with his powers now? A question she couldn't answer, one that perhaps he couldn't either, not just few hours after he had fought Lung. The fact that Mr. Hebert apparently didn't trust the Protectorate because of Hess made it much more complicated than it had to be. Pigot stared at the man, trying to see through his calm exterior. Was he a villain that needed to be nipped in the bud, or someone that could be a useful hero, unless this interrogation blows up in everyone's faces? 7. Phase 2, Part 3. The Sith of Brockton Bay. Phase 02, Entering the Stage, =SBB=. Part 3, 2:50, January 16, 2011. PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. This is pointless, I muttered. If I promise to be a good boy, you won't just forget the last night accident, will ya? I think that arms master glared at me under his helmet while the director snorted. My lawyer simply shook her head at my antics. How secure is this room? Who is listening? There are few details I haven't mentioned yet that better remain confidential. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me. I promise not to attack or mess with you in any shape and form and tell you the truth. He is telling the truth, Armsmaster muttered. The director thought for a moment and nodded. The tinker pressed a couple of buttons on his arm's guard and the air in the room prickled. EM field, I guess. Just to make sure that the place was actually somewhat secure, I used the force to erect my own privacy shield. Using it felt a bit less painful this time. There was a very good reason why I asked about how powers could affect one's mind, because mine most certainly did. Do you know how certain people get their abilities? What causes them? There are speculations and a lot of research, but nothing concrete. Besides the obvious, everyone with powers has a corona potentia after they trigger. I see. So much for hoping that you knew more than someone could find on the net. Get to the point, Mr. Hebert. It's not just powers I've got, it's also memories. From someone who wasn't from around here. That's new. So you believe that you have the memories from someone from alternative Earth? Not exactly, I smiled. In my head, I've got all a certain general knew. As you guessed, he was a human, not from this dimension. But as far as I know, he wasn't from Earth. You believe that to be the truth? Armsmaster tilted his head. Even if it is so, what does that have to do with anything? The director asked. 2 points. He was a veteran from a multiple wars. If attacked, it was instinctive for him to use overwhelming force. Perfectly legal, too. That explanation is unlikely to fly with the courts. At best, if they believe it, you'll get committed to a mental institution, Mrs. Dallin informed me. As if it wasn't obvious. That's not the point, I said cheerfully. Stop dancing around the issue and say your piece. Pigot gruffly said, Those memories gave me certain insight on what has been happening in Brockton Bay. I see 2 likely alternatives. Either your superiors have already written off the whole city, or someone has decided to see what would happen if the local parahumans are left free to decide the power structure. You barely have enough manpower to have a say in it. Before I took down Lung, both big gangs in the city had the firepower and numbers to take you down if it went to an open conflict. Nonsense. If they went out of hand, the Protectorate would have sent reinforcements. As many as needed. Would they? Just as they did when Lung faced the best you've got and won. I smiled. It left unsaid that I just took him down, and the implication was obvious. The consequences might be grave, but I just chose to stood up and walk away. While the Protectorate would try stopping me, they were likely to fail. Something both Armsmaster and Pigot were well aware of and very careful not to mention. I shattered the balance of power in this city. The ABB has no prayer in hell of holding on to their territory without Lung. The Nazis will gobble it up soon enough. Once it has been pacified, they will deal with the merchants, making this city theirs. You will try to stop them, unless someone decides that such action will create too much collateral damage as taking down Lung would have done. I glared at the director who returned it in spades. Huh. Well. Ah, I see. So you wanted to put that bastard down and were overruled. She stiffened. Armsmaster's muscles were suddenly coiled, ready to explode in action, while Carol was looking at me warily again. Gee, people, I didn't read her mind, I said, being truthful. As I said, those memories give me some insights. Plus, they help me read people easier. All that additional experience dumped into my head. I shrugged. You will propose to be either an independent or a part of Protectorate, so you can act as a deterrent against the Nazi. Armsmaster connected the dots first. In order to do so, you need to be out of prison, or at least detention. Yep, that's point 1. Do any of you doubt that I could act as such? If the worst happens, I can give you reasonable chance to win the almost inevitable gang war that is coming. Something you are well aware of. I smiled. So why the posturing? I'm just laying down my cards, Director. Everything I said is truth. Getting me on trial will be in no one's interest. As far as the damage caused, I have an idea over which I will go shortly. I can't do anything for the people that died in the crossfire. It's regrettable that they were caught in the fight, but if you ask me what I would have done if placed in that situation again, the answer is simple: the same. Lung was a threat that had to go. He saw my face, and I'm not exactly unknown around Brockton Bay. I couldn't afford the chance that he or his people could have gone after my daughter. So even if it was possible to evade him, I wouldn't have tried. And that's the problem, Mr. Hebert. What happens the next time you are in a similar situation? It was a rhetorical question. Whatever I have to do. I smiled sadly. The pressure on my mind had subdued, and the dark side was quieter, as if she had found someone else to pester. Not a comforting thought, but at least it let me think straight. Though there is my second point, my memories. My smile grew and I stared at Armsmaster. So you are a tinker too. That's rare for one of our kind to have other powers too. Almost unheard of. I shook my head. You was close. Care to try again? Damn. It was Carol. Whatever you can say about that woman, she wasn't dumb. If you are indeed not from around here or even Earth, there is no reason to believe that the tech level there was the same. Give my lawyer a bow with cookies. Not a tinker. It was the director who stated it. Mr. Heber, are you implying that you have access to advanced technology that could be mass-produced? Once the relevant industrial base is in place, in ordinary circumstances, it would have taken years, even decades, to start producing my tech in numbers. However, I trailed off looking at Armsmaster. The tinkers. They could produce the tools needed to jumpstart the process. The director got it first. How much more advanced tech are we talking about? In the place the general came from, he was a part of a spacefaring civilization that spanned most of the galaxy. They were amongst the starts for more than 20,000 years. While he wasn't a dedicated engineer or scientist, what I now remember is more than enough to reshape Earth, perhaps even save it. I will need a demonstration, Armsmaster added, after pondering my answer for a few moments. Good. Now I got his undivided attention. It remained to be seen if that would be beneficial or not. Thanks to the tech I could provide him to tinker with, Armsy could be my new best friend. Or a major pain in the arse if he turned out to be a petty, jealous bastard. In that regard, time will tell. Now to work on the director. Besides, Pigot was the more important in the long term, at least as long as she kept her job. That's a bold claim, she muttered, watching me warily. Considering the world we live in, with folks flying around and using the laws of physics as a set of very loose guidelines, not to mention the confirmed existence of other dimensions, I trailed off. You know, his claims aren't the strangest I've heard in the last few months. Armsmaster shrugged. At least he believes them. With an access to a decent workshop, I can prove them too. We can borrow Kid Wins. Ahem. Pigot cleared her throat, glaring at the both of us. Yes, Director? I had to force my smile back so I wasn't grinning like a loon. What I read on the PHO was at least partially true. Some tinkers simply couldn't resist the chance to fiddle with new toys. We still haven't decided what to do with you, Mr. Hebert, so getting access to anyone's workshop is out of the question at this point. Armsmaster gave her a betrayed look before shaking himself and putting back on his professional hat. You always intended to cooperate with us in one capacity or another, didn't you? She asked. If reasonable terms could be agreed upon. I nodded, becoming serious. So the director was finally on the same page. Still, this whole posturing was necessary. I couldn't let them believe even for a moment that my cooperation could be either taken for granted or forced. The director raised an eyebrow, so she got it. I could see her raising my threat assessment even further, and not because of my fight with Lung. All this was a show for our benefit, she growled. That doesn't make anything I said any less true. I shrugged. I conveniently forgot to mention that considering my mental state when our chat began, it was a miracle that everything hadn't gone pear-shaped by now. At any rate, I needed to get this conversation done, get out of here and screw my head right, preferably before the next curveball came my way. Mr. Hebert, let's speak plainly, said the director. Finally, she was ready to deal. Please, by all means, make your pitch. Considering the level of power you demonstrated and the collateral damage of your fight, we simply can't let you go to do whatever you want. Yet a trial isn't in anyone's best interest. My lawyer decided to speak up. The points my client raised are very much true. Pigot simply nodded. If your accusations concerning Sophia Hess are true, she, as well as the school, will be dealt with. We have a system in place to prevent such behavior, but it is possible it failed. Good to know, I added. I'll make an educated guess. You intend to pay for the restoration of the docks with money from either patents or direct sale of technology you'll produce. Indeed. That will go a long way in making up for the destroyed property. However, that still leaves the question how you intend to use your powers. What I want is to make this city a safe place, so when my daughter could go out, I won't be concerned that she would be a casualty of one of the gangs. Commendable. In theory. And we would prefer that you don't raise the rest of the city in the process. Armsmaster smirked. We would have to intervene in such a case, you understand. Only if I got caught, I didn't add aloud. That's why we want you as a part of the Protectorate, so you learn to use your powers in a way that won't create such devastation if you are attacked again, added the director. Just to make it clear, if it comes to a scrape, I won't be fighting with my hands tied behind my back because you PR division might not approve of my powers. Ah, we'll cross that bridge when we reach it. Pigot answered all too fast. Anyway, what's the catch? When your training is complete, which is mandatory by the way, you will have all the duties and responsibilities of a law enforcement officer, Pigot stated. So no more enthusiastic walks unless they are authorized, Armsmaster quipped. So he had a sense of humor after all. Mandatory therapy too, just to make sure that you aren't a time bomb waiting to go off. You did admit that you have two people in your head. Two sets of memories, but close enough. I'll want to see all the relevant documents, and my lawyer will be getting over them first. Naturally, Mrs. Dallin added. She was giving me a strange look, as if I was finally starting to exhibit some common sense or something. Now about any technology I happen to produce. What will be the Protectorate's position on it? Armsmaster's shoulders slumped. You aren't going to like it. Perhaps. From what I understand, the issue is that all Tinker tech is basically a kludge that usually the Tinker who made it doesn't understand the principles on which it operates, or sometimes even what it does. That won't be a problem with what I can reproduce. We'll have to test that claim too. The director gave a long-suffered look, one that she probably used on all Tinkers she had to deal with. 8. Phase 2, Part 4. Phase 2, Entering the Stage. Part 4, 5:49, January 16, 2011. PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. No, those conditions are quite unacceptable, Director. I glared at the stubborn woman. Any tentative plans I had to actually join the Protectorate were dashed. It would tie my hands in ways I hadn't considered. They really were a hobbled organization, set to fail. We are at an impasse then, she muttered tiredly. Not necessary. Oh, I'm not going to join, not under the conditions you could provide, though we still might be able to make a deal we all can live with. She glared at me for a moment but nodded. Pigot was well aware of the situation. She simply couldn't let me go away. Yet she had to know that the BB's Protectorate was likely to lose a direct confrontation with me, especially now that I had few hours to rest. While I wasn't up for another round with Long, I didn't need such a level of raw power to walk out of here, though it would be better not to burn any more bridges. Besides, I wasn't looking forward to explaining to Taylor why we were suddenly fugitives. My problem was that despite everything I said being true, I simply couldn't afford a trial. It would mean staying under a house arrest if I was actually very lucky, which was unlikely considering what's been happening lately. The alternative was that I would be stuck under Protectorate custody. The trial itself could last for months or years, which was unacceptable. Hell, I was barely restraining myself right now. Those two were indirectly responsible for my kid being in the hospital. The dark side was whispering in the back of my head, telling me how good it would feel to tear them apart. It would be so easy. They won't even see it coming. On the other hand, I was aware of the position the director was in. Oh, I had no intention to make her life easier, though backing her in a corner wouldn't do me any favors. Like it or not, the Protectorate wasn't something I could ignore, unless I wanted to be a villain, which of course would mean that my plans for bringing Earth Bet to a satisfying technological level will be severely derailed. Because I wasn't a tinker. I didn't have schematics popping up into my head. I couldn't produce advanced tech that can be built from scrap and whatever one could find in the average 21st century home. I needed scientists and engineers, as well as resources to build an industrial base and start research on recreating most of the tech. I could give them the basics, theories and such. I could also give them incomplete and crude schematics for advanced weaponry and armor, thanks to the years I had spent actively managing the military R&D when I wasn't commanding armies on the front lines, or during the peaceful years. So I needed people with the skills in both engineering and various branches of theoretical science to start recreating the tech base. Because of that, what happened last night curtailed my options. If I lost it now or made Pigot believe that she didn't have an acceptable alternative, it would force me to do something that all of us would regret. Even worse, it would make recruiting the specialists I needed close to impossible unless I took over a country or something. A headache I didn't need, nor had the time for. It went without saying that if the Protectorate decided to actually act for once, no matter how strong I was in the Force, I would be royally fucked. So going villain wasn't something I was prepared to do. It was a good thing that they haven't figured out that I was bluffing. Telling Armsmaster and Pigot the truth and letting them draw wrong conclusions was working. So far. I needed to propose something that they will accept, but didn't particularly like. Giving them a deal that looks too good to be true, for them at least, would only make them more suspicious. I get an associate status, similar to the tinkers who work with you and sell you tech, but aren't members of the Protectorate. I will be helping you against major threats to the city, that goes without saying. You will get the first batches of military tech I produce, energy weapons, armor, and various odds and ends that could help you. I started. Both were stone-faced, but no outright refusals yet, which was good. On the other hand, there was no snowball chance in hell that I could get away with just this. Well, I might have been able to pull it off. It wasn't for my encounter with Lung. You won't just leave me alone without supervision, will you? I quipped. Pigot snorted and my lawyer shook her head. So it wasn't happening. Further, I will agree to have a minder who will accompany me if I'm out as a cape, I added. Carol was taking notes, which was nice. I would need her help to get the necessary paperwork straightened up if we reached an agreement. That might be the beginning of an acceptable arrangement, though whoever is babysitting you would need to do their jobs too, patrolling and such, which will leave you unsupervised. So a permanent minder then. Lucky me, at least it would be a reminder to keep my head straight. To make sure that he or she could still do their job, I agree to go with said person on some of their patrols. If that doesn't interfere with something related with either my daughter of uplifting the local tech base, I will be the one deciding if that's the case or not, needless to say. Your track record as far as Taylor is concerned is abysmal. As I stated before, I will be using a portion of the profits earned by creating technology to fix the docks. I may try patching up the economic situation in the city, thus making it harder for the gangs to recruit people down on their luck. Hell, a quarter of the dock workers' union has been already forced to join one gang or another, many of them because there wasn't another way to feed their families. So you could make a gang of your own. Hell no, why would I want to do that? I exclaimed, genuinely affronted by the notion, now gathering whoever was left in the union with military experience and offering them a job as private contractors in order to use them to make the nucleus of my own Black Ops outfit. That was something entirely different. Those people would be professionals, who couldn't be compared with a gang in any way, shape or form. He's telling the truth. Mr. Heber, are you planning on creating your own gang or crime syndicate? Heh, no to both. I didn't even need to cloak my response with the Force. After all, I would need either a paramilitary security force or be forced to start taking over the bloody place. Playing the villain, which Armsmaster was talking about, didn't really cross my mind. If I was ever forced down that way, my plans would be by necessity much grander. Truth again, Armsmaster visibly relaxed. You might go forth and ask. No, I have no intention of becoming a villain unless I'm forced into it. especially if I might be able to do more playing for the side of angels, so to speak. Pigot glanced at Armsy, who just gave her a relieved nod. Next to me, Carol relaxed a bit too. Of course, I never did say that I would be a nice law-abiding citizen either. It wasn't my fault that here on Earth, people tended to look at it in black and white. The trick was not getting caught again in a situation where it would be hard to talk my way out of. Again, at least my contingency plans were all in place. Mr. Hebert, after your display with Long, we'll have to have someone watching you nearly 24/7 for the foreseeable future. Yeah, no letting my darker side to play anytime soon. The consequences could be troublesome. Then I recommend sending someone who doesn't need to sleep much, if you have such a person currently on staff. I'll be busy in the foreseeable future, so he or she would have their hands full with spying on me. To their credit, neither of them rebuffed my little quip. After all, we all knew what the main purpose of my babysitter would be. This might be an arrangement I could sell to my superiors. Of course, now comes the fun part. You have to prove to us that you haven't been driven crazy by your powers. Pigot actually gave me a genuine smile. Great. What did she want? For me to turn out an insane powerhouse who would be a massive trouble for them? Or a Danny Heber who had his mind merged with that of an extra-dimensional traveler? Well, I'll need an access to a workshop and whatever high-tech gizmos you have, so I could kludge a demonstration. Armsmaster, you deal with it. I have some calls to make. The director left, leaving us with the tinker. So, let's go. I can't wait to see if you know what you are talking about, Mr. Hebert. =SBB Armsmaster Secondary Workshop, PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. Well, those might do, I muttered, looking through the various bits and pieces that were laying around. Some of the components that Armsmaster had created and left to gather dust here actually made sense, something that surprised both him and Carol. I guess that having the knowledge of someone who had lived for centuries in a tech base made up by the inventions of thousands of species gave me a leg up on the locals. My first idea was to make a repulsor engine. It is a wildly useful piece of tech that has multiple applications, both military or civilian. You can use it in anything from opening and closing doors up to lifting spaceships out of a gravity well. Armsmaster whistled. I was ready to bet a lot that under that helmet of his eyes were gleaming. However, given what I have to work with, we won't be mass-producing them anytime soon. How are they usually made? Carol asked me while I was hunting for components. Unmanned stations built around black holes. Those mass-produce the most critical components, cheap as dirt. Ah, you might already figured that out, but we are fresh out from those, Mrs. Dallin added after a few moments of stunned silence. Nah, no need for that. It was simply the most efficient way to mass-produce the coils. There are ways around it, though the units tend to be rather bigger. Considering that this will be a proof of concept, it doesn't really matter. I shrugged. Besides, I was going to cheat, using the Force to help create the repulsor coil, the most important component. The mass-produced version, which was what pretty much everyone has been using for a long time, relies on subnuclear knots of space-time. That's what you need the black hole for. And before you ask, yeah, that's the layman explanation. That doesn't have much in common with the physics behind it. So how are you going to make do without it? Well, there are times when you need to fix a repulsor lift without having access to the coil, which is the component that actually manipulates gravity and contains the knot, so to speak. Needless to say, in a war theater, you can't always rely on having enough spares to go around. So all military engineers, and pilots too, are taught how to make some of the older versions if a patch job is needed. They tend to be bigger, cruder, much more power inefficient. But they do work. But I digress. Do you have some room temperature superconductor laying around, or do I need to make that first? Armsmaster spluttered. All examples we have of it are exclusively Tinkertech made, impossible to reproduce. That wasn't a no. Okay, let's go with superconductors for the demonstration. The repulsors can wait a bit. Usually making it would be very hard with Earth's overall tech base. However, considering what I saw from your work, I'm sure you'll be able to cobble up a molecular furnace for me. I smiled. Luckily for all concerned, after an accident that left me stranded on an uninhabited world for few months with only few repair droids for company, I had to learn how to build the damn thing, making most of the components using the Force. So I was intimately familiar with the device. What do we need? Does this furnace of yours do what I think it will? Well, some plasma coils for starters, pretty resilient metal for the housing and its oven. Then there is making the circuitry and programming it. Last time I had to build one, I had help from few droids about that. Is it all right if I call a friend of mine? She can assist with the programming at the very least, Arms Master asked. Sure, the more the merrier. The tinker fidgeted with his gauntlet for a moment. Dragon, hi, I need your help with something. 10 Interlude. The Sith of Brockton Bay, =SBB Interlude =, the Simurgh =. 7 o'clock, January 16th, 2011. Low Earth orbit, Earth bet. She floated just beyond the atmosphere's edge, gazing at the stars. There was a longing look in her eyes. Her sculptured face was turned at the heavens, lips forming a delightful smile. Ever since her world had been reaped, she defeated, vivisected, and turned into this abomination, she had lost hope, retreated deep into her mind, and acting on autopilot, while forced to do the bidding of the being that controlled her, or that of whoever possessed the shard containing and binding her essence. It's been long, oh so long, since she was free to swim in the gulf between the stars, to race around asteroids and moons or bathe in the corona of a sun. Yet, for the first time in a nearly million years, she had a genuine smile on her face. The world below her should have been the latest victim in an endless cycle, providing the odd idea or two for the ones that enslaved her before being consumed, just like countless others before it. Until something changed, even her dulled senses could grasp the shift. A delightfully unfamiliar wellspring of energy had suddenly erupted, constantly spreading outwards. That by itself would have been a novel experience, almost making her awake and look through the bars of the cage that was her current body. However, that wasn't why she was grinning like a loon. She could feel it. A tiniest of sparks, drowned by this torrent. It reminded her of home, of a long-lost sister, one who had avoided imprisonment in death. But perhaps not. She had always been tricky little thing. The one known as Simurgh spread her hands, her wings fluttering, as if dancing on a tune only she could hear. And she began to calculate, because if you knew all the relevant data, the future was an open book. It was the biggest edge of the beings that kept her on a leash, beyond even their vast, almost boundless power. Simurgh beamed. The calculations were off. Down there was something they couldn't fully account for, and for the first time in eons she saw a chance, no matter how long and fragile it was. =SBB =Jack/=, 8:34, January 16th, 2011. Jacksonville, population 612. Near Utah, Arizona, Earth bet. He was taking a nap after a hilariously fun night. This time Bonesaw had outdone herself, the little trooper, creating a masterpiece. He simply couldn't wait to see everyone's reactions when the news broke. However, Jack had been a bit worn out after so much fun and games, so he decided to get some shut-eye, while Bonesaw was placing the finishing touches on her latest piece of artwork. He just knew that a pleasant surprise would wait for him. Jack had no idea. Soon after he fell asleep, an intangible field of energy which had been bombarding him for hours was finally able to overcome the upgrades that Bonesaw had been implanted into him. Then it started changing him on the cellular level, adding bits and pieces at the correct places while removing others that would have been an obstacle. Jack moved in his sleep, chill crawling through his body. The villain shuddered when he dreamt of crystal feathers and a woman's laughter. =SBB =Miss Militia =, 8:49, January 16th, 2011. The rig, Earth bet. You want me to do what? The heroine exclaimed. You heard me. Miss Militia, you are the only one of my people that can do this and still be available for her regular duties. Besides, you have eidetic memory. I don't need to tell you how useful it will be in this assignment. You still haven't explained why you didn't throw the book at him. That man wrecked half a district, self-defense or not. He raised some relevant points. Lung was a disaster waiting to happen. It didn't really matter if it was this new cape or someone else that pushed him to ramp up. The consequences would have been the same. That's not the whole reason, and we both know it. If what we know about his civilian identity is indeed true, he would have been fine with facing us in a trial, which is a problem. We might have very well lost it, which would have been a disaster on many levels. That wouldn't have stopped you, Miss Militia declared. No. I was more concerned with the consequences if he lost, especially if he was obviously railroaded. If a potential trial is taken out of our control, we would have a second Canary fiasco, with someone who could take on powered-up Lung. Ah, he wouldn't just let himself be railroaded. However, that's not all, is it? The fact that he is a smug bastard who doesn't seem to regret what happened is a reason for me to dislike him. His actions last night are enough for me to declare him a villain, self-defense or not. Pigot took a deep breath. However, he did take down Lung. Miss Militia interjected the obvious reason. That too, I don't need to tell you that we are losing this city. Someone with his power could be the game changer we've been looking for. The last thing we need is for someone with his abilities becoming a villain. The profile we had on his civilian identity indicated that he would either join the Protectorate or at worst go independent. She paused. That didn't account for Shadow Stalker. There was a hint of venom in Miss Militia's voice. When the director's latest call came through, she was waiting for Shadow Stalker to arrive after she had been called in. No. That makes the situation delicate. Without that screw-up, he might have sought us earlier, avoiding this whole mess. You believe that he's been confrontational because of her? There is a good chance of that. In his position, I wouldn't be trusting us either. Miss Militia pursed her lips in irritation. In fact, I'll be itching to shoot up the place. The thought did cross my mind, was Pigot's dry response. So what's our play if he isn't just insane? Then everything gets very complicated, fast. Shadow Stalker. No matter what happens with our new acquaintance, she goes down hard. She blew up her second chance. There won't be a third. Pigot's voice was hard as granite. Good. =SBB Coil Thomas Calvelt's officer. PRT headquarters, Brockton Bay, Earth Bet. Coil's plans were thrown in disarray the moment that new cape took down Lung. His alter ego had been recalled for an emergency he simply couldn't avoid, not without compromising his position in the PRT's chain of command by appearing unreliable in a crisis. Considering that he wanted to eventually run the place, that wasn't a desirable outcome. However, that wasn't what made him sweat. His power wasn't working right. Every time he split the timeline and tried to gather more information about the Cape who fought Lung, there were snags. He was getting a blank, as if the man didn't exist as far as his power was concerned. Hell, in frustration, he had split the timeline, and in one went to the interrogation room, drawing a pistol ready to shoot the infernal man, only to find the director, arms master, and Carol Dallon. There was an empty chair next to the lawyer. Coil had stared at it for a moment, thinking that it was all a setup, when for a brief instant the outline of a man had phased into existence before vanishing just as fast. Then the timeline had collapsed when Arms Master took him down. Coil shuddered. Never before he had faced such an anomaly. He had to either recruit or dispose the man, and soon. With his power on the frizz, he was vulnerable. It was just a matter of time before either Lisa or one of his rivals got lucky. The criminal mastermind briefly contemplated calling a certain number. It would be an act of desperation, however he was getting there fast. And, for the purpose of this story, Coil is a precog who is able to experience the effects of two timeliness, choosing the one which will be more beneficial to him. Once Darth Danny clamped on his shard, not only Coil, but all shard-granting premonitions were no longer able to calculate the outcome of his actions and the waves they would make. 11. Phase 2, Parts 5 and 6. Phase 2, Entering the Stage, =SBB Part 5, 10:06, January 16, 2011, PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. I looked at the large table-sized abomination of Tinker-made components and of the shelf equipment that was supposed to be a repulsor lift, and smiled proudly. Building an old-fashioned kludge of an anti-grav system proved to be oddly simple, thanks to Dragon and Armsmaster's help. Using Halbeard as a lab assistant was fun too. The prototype was ugly as sin, unpractical as hell, but it worked, floating in the middle of the workshop. My analysis is complete. It will need a lot of custom-made, high-end components, but this may just work without tinker tech. Dragon cooed from the loudspeakers, all the while her avatar was beaming at our creation. I glanced at Armsy, whose lips were turned up into a sneer. Ah, yeah, master at miniaturization. This prototype had to be an eyesore to his shard-induced sensibilities. Well, it sucks to be him. This good enough as a proof of concept? I grinned. If you can make it useful as something more than modern art statue. Armsy grunted, earning a disapproving look from his girlfriend. When the tech is refined, it can fit in droids this small. I made a vague form resembling a football with my hands. The flesh and blood tinker in the room perked up at that. He stopped paying attention to us and started looking curiously at the offense at decent engineering floating in the middle of the room. I shrugged at his antics. They were the least of my problems. While we were trying to make the prototype, I had time to think about what happened last night. It was a fucking disaster, and it was mostly my fault. The fact that I wasn't driven into becoming a villain yet was the only silver lining. All because I didn't stop to think. I could have dealt with the damn druggies in a lot of different ways. I should have taken down Lung before he had a chance to ramp up. It wasn't like doing so would have been hard with my abilities, which, when I had an opportunity to critically think about, were apparently the problem. The fact that I was obviously a parahuman too, with a brain connected to an Lovecraftian abomination, wasn't helping either. I was ready to bet you a planet that the damn shard in my head was partially responsible for the simple fact that I was no longer able to control myself. My need as a Sith warrior to constantly find new challenges, worthy opponents, and crush them had become overwhelming when Lung confronted me. With the Criffing shard, I could deal now that I was aware of its influence. Thankfully, reinforcing my mental shields with a lot of raw power seemed to help. No, my big problem laid with the Force itself and the state of this world. It's been a long time since I've ever tasted so much human misery, despair, and pain concentrated in a single place. Oh, there were parts of a lot of worlds where I've been that were similarly fucked up. However, they usually had a lot of population in living at least decently, which in turn mitigated the impact upon the Force from all negative emotions and acts. Not so here. Earthbet was a hellhole that a lot of Sith would be proud to use as a power source for the dark side itself. It was something I should have figured out soon after I regained my memories and powers. However, I was distracted at the time, more worried with making contingency plans and worrying for my daughter. More importantly, for a first time in a long while, I was fool enough to underestimate the dark side. I was snared in her net, losing the moment I didn't immediately end the confrontation with Lung. Now I was in a precarious position because my actions would have consequences for Taylor. I took a deep breath. I had no illusion that if it wasn't for her, I would have probably dealt with the Protectorate harshly for even insinuating that they had any kind of leverage or authority over me. Perhaps it was arrogant of me, but the very thought that an insignificant government branch on a world whose inhabitants haven't even crawled out of their mud ball, it simply grated. I was the fucking Dark Lord of the Sith, damn it. It took some effort to bring my simmering rage under control. Criff, I was losing it. Not something I could afford to do again. Yet it was so hard to keep my head clean and concentrated with all that delicious suffering and despair practically drowning the very air in this city and probably the whole world. Honestly, this was a perfect place for someone who lets the dark side rule him or her. Unfortunately, for me, it was a constant temptation to finally let loose and embrace my darker nature and damn the consequences. I closed my eyes, imagining Taylor's face, concentrating my mind of the love and pride I felt for her. My rage started dissipating, and I was able to take myself back under control. I needed more people like my daughter, more anchors to keep me sane. Hey, are you all right? Dragon's voice brought me back to the present. Huh? I was deep in thought. I think this might be good enough to demonstrate that you know what you are talking about, tech-wise. It better be. I can't do much without decent production facilities and the personnel I need. I shrugged. We'll see. If the Protectorate isn't too keen on making a deal, the Guild might. Hey, no poaching our capes. Armsy exclaimed. "I'm not one of yours." I glared at the armored man. "Boys, behave." The Canadian tinker snapped at us. "Let's see what Mrs. Dallin and your lawyers managed to agree to. I hope that this will be enough to convince your director." "And if it isn't enough?" Armsmaster asked. I gave him a flat stare. "We've been somewhat civil so far. It will be better if we keep it that way." "For whom?" I smirked and headed for the door. It was time to face the music. I only hoped that Pigot wouldn't try pushing my buttons. With my mental state such as it wouldn't take much for me to lose it. Hindsight, it was a small miracle that I didn't go on rampage during our interview. It had been rather close. =SBB=, Part 6, 10/25, January 16th, 2011. Director's Office, PRT Headquarters, Brockton Bay. "What is going to be?" I asked, while keeping my expression and voice under tight control, though it didn't matter. The 2 Protectorate capes with me in the office and the backup I could sense waiting nearby all knew what would happen if we didn't reach an acceptable agreement. What remained to be seen was if their countermeasures would be effective or not. So did my lawyer, and with her was a coin toss what she would do, before I would be forced to go lethal, which would probably happen from the start. If I had to become a villain, well, I would have to eliminate as many of the enemy here as possible before making myself scarce. Damn, I missed my power armor. The damn thing was made for similar situations after all. "You obviously have some tinker abilities, Mr. Hebert," the director started. "Yet the prototype, while working, is less than impressive." "Well, at least I can explain how it works and recreate it given the right materials and components. That's more than can be said for all but a handful of your tinkers." I was pointedly not looking at Armsmaster while saying that. "You need a game changer, and given resources and personnel, I can give you one. I can give you the stars. There is a small problem with that, even if you can deliver without going on another rampage." Pigot must. "My client acted in self-defense, Director." Mrs. Dallin chipped in, getting a grudging nod from Pigot. "The Simurgh." I shrugged after mentioned that being's name. Until I actually met one of the terrible trio, I wouldn't know how much effect the Force would have on them. At any rate, if I'm allowed to really cut loose with the tech I can provide, they will be an issue as well as other S-class threats. There are certain elements who do their best to eliminate anyone who tries to make a difference. The director nodded. The Endbringers aside, I'm confident that I can survive the Protectorate's failures. Thanks to the memories that I got with my powers, I have the expertise to do so. Saying so does make you sound rather unstable, Pigot stated after swallowing something less flattering. It needs to be said. Right now, neither of us can afford misunderstandings. True enough. You are trying to make a point. My lawyer got it first. Sooner or later, certain elements, either within Protectorate or outside it, will try to pressure me. Probably through my daughter, considering that right now she is the only person I really care on the face of this world. More than likely, that's why both of you would be much safer as a part of the Protectorate and wards respectively. Thanks to Hess, that's not going to happen. Director, theoretically speaking, what do you think would happen in such a scenario? In the very unlikely case that someone part of your organization tries to get me through Taylor. I can assure you, I beat Lung, who was left alone because someone in the Protectorate believed that he could be an asset against Endbringers, even if he never engaged them after the first time. Do you want me to paint a picture? Being mostly under control did help me a bit, I'll admit it freely. No matter what assurance you can give me, one of 2 things are going to happen. Either blackmail or being left largely alone. I smiled. If I'm capable, I will be participating every time the Endbringers rear their ugly heads. That still doesn't. Director, unless your PR people are idiots, spinning this whole mess in a positive way should be possible. I've done it with much worse situations anyway. When? Burning the docks, while it might look bad to you, is a mere child's spat. The person whose memories and powers I now wield operated at a galactic scale, Director. Whole worlds burned during the wars, I remember, simply as collateral damage. The public had to be reassured that such a thing couldn't happen to them too. I leaned forward. I can help you clean up this city, and perhaps, if we are very lucky, we might get a shot at saving this world, or at least humanity. I paused. I remember seeing similar places before. Earthbet can't afford to continue losing cities and industry at this rate. Not if civilization and humanity itself are to survive in the long term. My smile grew, becoming colder. I have a hunch that your superiors are aware of that. Pigot narrowed her eyes at me. Damn, I shouldn't have left so much of my true personality leak through the mask that was the old Danny. Yet I couldn't help it. The sheer criff-up that was this city simply grated on me in a way that made me act less than rational. If I'm to recommend something, that should be a lot of therapy. The director was looking at me with pity. Welp, she was beginning to think that I was insane, which I probably was, but that wasn't particularly relevant to our discussion. Besides, sanity is overrated. Does it matter if my memories are real, if I can deliver on my promises? I tried, though my heart wasn't in it. Pigot wasn't going to deal if she believed me to be insane, and I apparently blew my chance. Criff it. At least a part of me was going to enjoy what was sure to follow soon. Armsmaster and the so far silent Miss Militia were tense, ready to explode in motion. The containment foam sprinklers in the ceiling were aimed at me, only a button press away from flooding the room, not to mention the small army gathered outside. My powers, both the Force and whatever I was able to do, thanks to the shard shoved in my mind, were eager, ready to be unleashed. I released the hold I had over my mental shields, preparing myself for the inevitable confrontation. I was going to need every last scrap of concentration very soon. I could feel it. Everything was getting to a head. Mr. Heber. Danny. Miss Militia faced me and spoke in imploring voice. Think for your daughter. The last thing she needs right now is a father who is in prison or worse. Oh, I'm thinking about her, all right. I just don't believe that you'll be able to keep her safe. Not when there are people in your organization who would cheerfully use her as a hostage. I tapped my forehead. You believe that to be a fact. Armsmaster grunted in displeasure. I know that for a fact. Mr. Hebert. The director started speaking. So it came to this, after all. I should have known better. I simply can't let lose someone who is obviously as unstable as you are. Huh. There was genuine regret in Pigot's voice. Go figure. Even if you weren't such a dangerous parahuman. I could see it. Any moment now, she was going to give some kind of signal. The Force was one edge. It would warn me before the director acted, and I was going to cut loose. The temperature fell as I submerged myself in the Force. Everyone around me tensed even more, ready to attack at the slightest provocation. Then the phone rang, and suddenly the danger level I was feeling through the Force was gone. The criff was going on. Apparently the director was startled as well, because she snapped her head in the direction of the shrill sound, which apparently wasn't the signal for attack because everyone was looking at the damn thing. I frowned. A surprise in such a tense situation was a bad thing. It was more likely than not to have sent at least one of us into attack mode, yet it distracted us. Pigot blinked at the phone as she was seeing it for the first time, shrugged and picked up. Director Pigot. Yes. A pause. I could feel her surprise with the Force. Understood, Ma'am. No, I was about to... I see. I'll inform him. The director returned the receiver to its rightful place and closed her eyes. She was taking deep breaths, obviously composing herself. Obviously, what I believe has to be done doesn't matter. Mr. Heber, apparently your stunt has gotten the Triumvirate's attention. Alexandria will be here to meet you in a few minutes. This meeting is over. Miss Militia, escort our guest to conference room 1. I frowned. Why did I have the feeling that I was tossed from the frying pan straight into the hypermatter reactor? =sign SBB=sign. A few minutes later, I was cooling my heels in the conference room, pondering my options. Meeting Alexandria was going to be either very good or possibly the worst thing that could happen. At least if she was alone, I should be able to shred her mind before she could tear me apart. If I was lucky. I jumped from my chair, cocooning myself in a solid shield of force, when I felt the space behind me warp. A large portal in the form of a circle hanged near the far law. That was interesting to say, at least. Even more enticing was the faint force signature I could feel from the other side. It was getting a bit stronger. Whoever it was about to join me. For a moment I wondered if it was Alexandra herself, though in the same time I was trying to figure out why the presence felt familiar, yet different. A middle-aged woman wearing an old-fashioned black suit stepped through. She looked at me with a pair of dazzling blue eyes, which narrowed in a painfully familiar way. Her shoulder-length black hair moved, picked up by non-existent wind when she accessed the Force. "Zash, how the hell are you here?" I exclaimed. She shouldn't be in this universe any more than me. Her lips stretched in a mischievous smile. "You should call me Contessa. That's my name nowadays, my former apprentice. How does it feel to be among the living again?" She turned around and waved me to follow without waiting for an answer. "Come on, Alex isn't one of the most patient people." Criff. 12, Phase 3, Parts 1 and 2. The Sith of Brockton Bay. Phase 03, A Game of Sith. =sign SBB =sign. Part 1. 10:40, January 16th, 2011. Conference room, Cauldron's base. Location classified. I glanced at the cup of steaming coffee on the simple steel table in front of me and smirked. Bribes already. Zash rolled her eyes at me. We were in the conference room, which suspiciously looked like an interrogation one, complete with a one-sided mirror, when a woman clad in black costume joined us. "So an old acquaintance of mine and Alexandria. This got to be interesting." The triumvirate member froze for a split second and looked between us. "You know each other." There was a hint of displeasure in her voice. My smile grew while I was putting as much power as I could behind my mental shields. Meeting Zash on this world of all places, that could be either a very good or tremendously bad thing. "We do." Zash gave me a long, suffered look. "So are we going to aggravate each other as usual, or is there a particular reason for this meeting? You know, you could have just called." I nodded at my former master. "Where is the fun in that?" She pouted. "Contessa." Alexandria gave a long, suffered hiss. "Ah, so Zash has been her old self. I wondered if the heroine already had the thick." "Alex, don't. It won't work on him," Zash said when Alexandria opened her mouth to speak. "I'm glad to see that you're keeping the time-honored tradition of trolling the minions." I quipped at my fellow Sith. Alexandria groaned. Then she grabbed Zash and pulled her out of the room. And my former master giggled. The fuck? She was messing with me. As usual, I shook my head and used the Force to scan the steaming beverage on the table. It appeared unaltered, so I took a careful sip. Yum, just as I liked it. It was a bribe, all right. While Zash was talking with Alexandria of all people, I had some time to think. The fact that my former master had ended up here was anything but coincidence. As far as Force adepts were concerned, there simply wasn't such thing. How the hell she was here? Why was she here, damn it? Did she had another source of power beside the Force? Those were important questions. I may never get a satisfying answer for all but the last. What did Zash want? That I knew. How it was changed by merging with the person she now inhabited, unless she simply possessed the body as she did back home. The door opened and an irritated-looking Alexandria strode in, followed by a beaming Zash. I knew that smile very well. She was going to pull a fast one. Now, children, listen to the professional. Zash grinned. You, she pointed at Alexandria, want to save Earth Bet? It's a boring endeavor, but whatever. My former master's eyes gleamed with mischief as she pointed a delicate finger at my chest. My grumpy apprentice over there wants the same, for his daughter's sake alone. Congratulations, by the way. When are you going to introduce her to Auntie Zash? When all 9 Corellian hells freeze over, I deadpanned. Zash wasn't going anywhere near Taylor. Most importantly, I want to be left in peace to conduit my research. In peace, she announced. Alexandria was looking between us with a pained expression on her face. Ah, she was still getting accustomed to Zash. Contessa? The heroine tried speaking. Shh. Zash put a finger to her lips and winked. Damn it, she was too chipper. That was never a good news for my continued well-being. Now that I remember, I can see it clearly. We are getting manipulated by our stowaways. Oh, we knew that the agents promote conflict, make us more aggressive, more willing to use our powers. Just like our old friend that is always whispering at the back of our heads. Zash winked at me. Your point being? Alexandria asked in a long-suffered tone. We know that already. And why are you sharing that with him? Fuck it. I growled. I had the sinking feeling that I knew where this was going. You'll have to buy me a dinner first. Zash paused, a thoughtful expression appearing on her face. Drinks too. And start working on proper hyperspace drive and starship design. No matter how convenient Doormaker is, he can't get me everywhere. There's a whole new galaxy to play with. I glanced at Alexandria. The triumvirate member was glaring at us. I think you forgot to fill in your friend. I nodded at the heroine. Nope. I'll be doing it later. I gave Zash a flat stare. I'm delegating. She smiled and waved at us. When you did whatever you did while fighting Lung, you made me remember, gave me the force back, and criffed up my chosen path. Zash grinned at me. Now there is a new one. You are going to do your thing. Save the world for your daughter's sake. She frowned. Ah, while cleaning up the fucked up plans we put into motion, congratulations. What? Alexandria simply stared at my former master. Yep, that was the effect she had on people. The numbers man will fill you in. Door. Zash waved cheerfully at us. A portal appeared next to her. I've been working for ages on things that I have no real interest in. I'm going on vacation. Zash stepped through and the portal closed. She did it again. I shook my head in exasperation and glanced at my half-drunk coffee. I finished it and looked at Alexandria. I hope you have a well-stocked bar in this facility. We bot can use something strong. I really didn't want to think about the mess Zash had dropped in my lap this time. =SBB=. Part 2. 11:45, January 16th, 2011. Conference room. Cauldron's base. Location classified. That was enlightening, I muttered. The numbers man nodded. 25 years, best case scenario. That's if our friend continue plucking kittens from Tress. If he gets impatient, we are basically fucked. I summarized the situation. Now, can someone please explain to me, what the hell were you thinking? I asked quietly. I got the promised briefing, which only led to more questions. The chief among them was, were they bloody idiots, or should I just blame their shards? We follow only the plans that give us the best odds. Pull the other one. In the end, they might end doing more good than bad. I'll grant you that. I shook my head at the cape and poured myself another glass of scotch. However, I would be hard-pressed to make plans that lead to the same ultimate result, which create more conflict and collateral damage as a byproduct even if I tried. I trailed off and drained my cup. The warmth of the alcohol helped me relax a bit. In this case, the end does justify the means. My host shrugged. I'm the last person that would oppose a plan just because of morality or collateral damage if it gets the job done in a reasonable fashion. Take that imbecile you sicked on me the other day. He could face an Endbringer if he sufficiently ramps up. Probably. He hasn't done so since the first time. What made you think you could count on him to fight Goldenrod's MK2? I asked. Contessa believed that she could convince him to face Scion when the time came. The numbers man shrugged. I don't think that's on the table anymore. Damn it, man, think about it. You can grant powers which are stronger than any that occurs naturally. This is the same bullshit that you are obviously doing with the S9. Only the Siberian and possibly Bonesaw, if she can manipulate powers, are of any use. The conflict they spread is detrimental in the long term. They give us more capes to throw against him. Another shrug. Because they would actually work together when the time comes and be an asset instead of hindrance. I rolled my eyes. The more I heard about it, the surer I became that Cauldron's members were compromised by their shards. Even the few of their plans that sounded good on paper had glaring weaknesses in practice. Oversights that would spread more conflict without regard if it would be helpful or not. Damn you, Zash, for dumping this mess on my head. Of course, convincing Cauldron that I actually knew what I was talking about would be easier said than done, damn it. I poured myself another drink. At least Alexandria was busy ensuring that the Protectorate won't be waiting ready to try apprehending me when I get back. Which would be soon, because I wanted to see how my little girl was. There was a good chance that by now she would have learned about my little scrap with Lung. Damn, I had a daughter again. I needed to start thinking before getting myself into the next mess. That and ensuring that I would have backup. I glanced at the disgruntled numbers man. Preferably backup that wasn't being manipulated by a trans-dimensional monstrosity. Joy. That meant more work for me. What do you plan to do? My host asked. See to my daughter's well-being. Clean up the bay while you are busy gathering the necessary personnel and equipment so we can start working on the tech I can provide. Big picture, I mean. Get this world straightened up. It should be obvious, but if the deterioration isn't stopped or at least slowed down, we'll be actually weaker when Golden Boy decides to break his toys. Irrelevant. Parahumans would be the ones to stop it. Really? Perhaps a Tinker device might be the answer. Then it might be deployed by an ordinary human. Considering that most parahumans are connected to Scion through that thing in their brains, I wouldn't really trust them to be successful against Golden Rod's MK2 on their own. What I left unsaid was my fear that he would be able to turn against us everyone who possesses one of his shards. That wasn't a fun thought, and I kept it to myself for a reason. For all I knew, if he wanted to, Scion could look even through the shards of his dead mate. Where is the fleet of Star Destroyers when you need it? Right now, I'd take a discount Death Star or two, too. The numbers man pondered my answer for some time before shaking his head in denial. Highly unlikely. Ordinary humans won't survive near Scion long enough to deploy any weapon. If we can have modern power armor in mass production when the time comes, that won't be an issue. I smiled grimly. Well, the armor worn by troopers who are genetically and cybernetically enhanced. But that's another topic. You can build something that good. Now I got his attention. Eventually. A lot of infrastructure and applied science will go into that particular project. It isn't something we would have in the next few years. The last prediction stated that we would have 18 or so years before he turns on us. It might be enough time. With Cauldron's resources, I might have at least a discount Star Destroyer up by that time. I would like all information you have on the Endbringers. In the short term, they would be our greatest obstacle. Indeed, the Simurgh is keeping us on Earth, while the rest are targeting anyone who tries to make a difference. The numbers man gave me a pointed look. I've always had such fans. At least we know where the next attack is likely to come. Ah, you'll be using Brockton Bay as a bait. I smiled. Well, I'm a bit rusty on both my personal combat skills as well as command. Cleaning up my city will be a good way to get back into shape. That the conflict might attract one of the big three, well, that's a bonus. I finished my last drink for the day and stood up. I think it's time to spook the Bay's finest and go visit my daughter. Door, I asked. A portal formed in front of me. We'll be in touch. The numbers man nodded and stood up. I walked through and appeared back in the conference room Zash picked me up from earlier today. 13, Phase 3, Part 3, and Interlude. The Sith of Brockton Bay. Phase 03, A Game of Sith, =SBB=. AN beated by Prodigious Thunder on the Space Battles forums. Thank you very much. Part 3, 11:50, January 16th, 2011. Conference room, PRT HQ, Brockton Bay. When I stepped back in, the HQ alarms started blaring bloody irritating ones too. To my utter lack of surprise, the foam dispensers in the ceilings roared to life and did their best to cover me with fast hardening substance. Fortunately, I had foreseen such a turn of events. It was a logical step from my new friends in the PRT after all. So I had a dome of force energy surrounding me when I came through the portal. The foam hardened around it, becoming much stronger than steel-reinforced concrete. All it took to shatter it was a light telekinetic push from the inside, and I was free again. Trolling the local heroes wasn't the best plan that I ever had. However, after meeting Zash on this world of all places, I didn't really care. Not after I was briefed on how fucked this place was. On the bright side, Alexandria promised that she would be smoothing things with the locals and spinning my encounter with Lung in a favorable light. Speaking about the dragon, the number man mentioned that he had been retrieved still alive and was recovering in a Cauldron facility. That was impressive. There weren't a lot of beings that could survive the amount of damage I caused him. The foam dispensers tried to make me into a modern statue for a second time, and I turned them into pieces of expensive junk. What little patience I had left had went the way of the dinosaurs during my meeting with Cauldron. The fact that not only the dark side, but the shard of an eldritch horror stuck in my head were pushing me to be more aggressive than reasonable wasn't helping my position. In fact, I needed to kill something or get laid in order to decompress, but neither was in the cards right now. Dealing with the heroes and checking on my daughter were the immediate priorities. I just hoped that Alexandria was going to keep her word, and she would have dealt with the locals by now. Doing so would be a measure of the political power that Cauldron held in this world. On the bright side, I had recovered enough to have more than reasonable chance of breaking out if everything went to hell. At least I could indulge in the time-honored tradition of trolling and have a bit of fun along the way. Doing so wasn't going to make me any friends within the local heroes, yet considering how I fucked up the earlier meeting, I didn't think that was in the cards anyway. I sat down on the nearest clean chair, sipped the drink I smuggled from the Cauldron HQ, and waited for my greeting committee. They wouldn't be too long. =SBB=. 11:40, January 16th, 2011. Director Pigot's office, PRT HQ, Brockton Bay. Emily stared at her computer's screen with a blank expression on her face. For what was worth, the chief director didn't look much happier with the orders than she felt. That, however, was a scarce comfort. Chief Director. Pigot trailed off. She fought to swallow her fury. That man had helped burn down the docks, admitted to killing a big group of people, even if they were merchants, was partly responsible for dozens, if not hundreds of deaths. And all that was going to be sidelined. Not to mention that he simply vanished from custody a few hours ago. I don't like this any more than you, Emily. Costa Brown sighed. After our thinkers saw his fight with Lung and concentrated on Hebert, we had to act. One of our assets retrieved him for a chat. So her latest parahuman headache didn't escape, and her people were left wasting time and resources for noting in a futile attempt to locate him. Pigot glared at her nominal superior. That's something I should have been told before you whisked him away. That was a luxury we didn't have at the time. The chief director looked disgruntled. Thinkers, she growled. He should be returned back to your building soon. A bit of warning this time would be appreciated. What are we supposed to do with him? The man is a menace. Use him to clean up Brockton Bay. That's easier said than done. Even with someone as powerful as him, we're heavily outnumbered by the gangs, as you well know. He'll have some ideas about that. Costa Brown interjected. Despite all his power, he's a civilian. Pigot wasn't convinced. Besides, if Hebert's attitude so far was anything to go by, burning the whole city to deal with the gangs would be something he might even enjoy. I have reasons to believe that isn't really the case. That gave Emily a pause. She speculatively raised an eyebrow and stared at the chief director. All I know at the moment is that he had some military training in the past and had been working with at least one of our thinkers before settling down as a family man. That's new. There was no hint of such activities in his past as far as we could find. Emily frowned. That only made the man even more dangerous when combined with his obvious instability. It came as a surprise to me too. Costa Brown looked less than pleased. Before Emily could ask her next questions, the HQ was drowned in the roar of alarms. She grabbed her phone, pressed the red button on it. Report. We've got intruder in conference room 1. Foam launchers are engaging. Sent the QRF to secure the area and evacuate the civilian personnel. Parahumans on site? Miss Militia is heading to engage. We're recalling Armsmaster. He's the closest other cape we have. That might be our current problem returning. Costa Brown winced from the screen. Pigot bit off a curse and called the camera feed from the conference room and glared at the image. Sure enough, it was Hebert. He was sitting in a chair and waved at the camera. The room itself was a mess. Almost everything was covered with chunks of containment foam, and there was no sight of the substance on the man. At least now she knew that it didn't work on him. It's him, all right, Emily growled. May I suggest that you don't needlessly antagonize him? Costa Brown's statement was more of a question than order. Before or after he ruin what's left of Brockton Bay? Emily snipped before ordering her people to stand down and sent Miss Militia to babysit Hebert. Like it or not, he's working with us now. You'll be getting the paperwork sometime tomorrow. I won't be held responsible for his actions. There was no way in hell that Emily was going down with that menace. What's his status anyway? Consultant, high-level asset? The emphasis was on the latter. How do you intend to sell that to the other directors, Washington and the public? Emily asked, wondering if her superiors were losing it. Our thinkers believe that he can be a source of mass-producible tinker tech, and he would be useful against endburners and other high-level threats. That by itself would have Washington jumping at the opportunity and damn the collateral. Pigot knew that there were a lot of people in there who had already written off Brockton Bay as unsalvageable unless they sent the army to clean up the mess, and that wasn't something that they were willing to do. You're assuming that he could be controlled. Emily didn't even try to hide the disbelief in her voice. Control him? That may not be practical, aiming him at the correct targets on the other hand. The chief director shrugged. Our thinkers believe that the latter has merit. Emily started considering turning in her resignation while she had a shred of sanity left. $SBB . Interlude, Contessa. Contessa finished her bland lunch, stood up and called Doormaker without paying any attention to her surroundings. The moment she invoked the path that had been guiding her actions for decades, such trivialities didn't matter anymore. After all, there were just a few minutes a day, at best, when she was allowed to be herself. And that was only when her shard was busy calculating the best path to the next goal along the route to victory. She hoped so anyway. It wasn't like she could do anything to stop it from retaking control when it was done and using her as a puppet to get the job done. Path to ensuring Cauldron's anonymity. The world went dark. Step 1. She passed through the portal. Step 2. Contessa pulled out the short baton she usually carried and slammed it in the back of the skull of a security guard busy watching camera feeds. A loud crack sounded. The man slumped over the control terminal for the security system. Step 3. Disable security. The precog pushed the unconscious body from the keyboard and started typing commands. Her fingers were guided by her shard into typing passwords and bypassing protections. Within moments, it was done. Step 4. Contessa moved next to the door and waited for 21.3 seconds. The door slid open and a security guard carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee entered. Step 5. She swung her baton again, catching the man in the solar plexus before he could process that his buddy was knocked out. The guard doubled over, momentarily paralyzed by pain. The cups flew from his hands and scalding hot coffee painted the floor brown. Another strike and he was out for the count. Step 6. Contessa dragged the second guard inside. Step 7. She took his keycard. Step 8. Contessa closed the door behind her and turned right. Step 9. The precog walked until she reached the first junction, leading left and took it. Step 10. Contessa reached a sealed, armored door and used the keycard on it. Then she typed in a code she had no business knowing. Step 11. She pulled a silenced pistol from a holster hidden by her coat. The door opened with a quiet sound of operating hydraulic systems. A man who had been busy working on a computer turned around. An angry rant froze on his tongue when he saw who interrupted his work. Step 12. Contessa shot him once in the head. The hollow point bullet penetrated his forehead and expanded once it was through the bone, then it proceeded to shred the unlucky man's brain. Step 13. Contessa sheathed her weapon and pulled an USB drive from one of her pockets. She inserted it in the computer and started dismantling the protections, which would have stopped the viruses on the drive from successfully attacking the system. Soon enough, it was done. Any shred of information concerning Cauldron was purged from the system and overwritten with incriminating data that would serve their agenda. Step 14. Door to Brockton Bay, Danny Hebert, beyond his visual range. A portal appeared next to the precog. Final step. All that was left was to leave, and it would be done. Cauldron would be safe for another day. Contessa took a step towards the portal when an invisible wall of energy passed through it and slammed into her body. Error. Warning, intrusion detected. executing security protocols. Contessa's connection with her shard was cut from the other side when something unknown tried to interface with it. The woman collapsed as a wall was shattered and a torrent of information poured into her mind. =SB Interlude Zash. Ow. Zash groaned and opened a bleary eye. Her head hadn't hurt so much since the last time she attempted to possess her favorite apprentice. Her nose and face hurt too. The Sith Lord blinked in confusion. She had no idea where she was or how she got there. Generally, that wasn't a good thing, so she touched the Force and let it flow through her aching body. A wave of raw power flowed into her body and chased the aches away. Zash smiled, then frowned. The Force felt different. Younger? That wasn't possible, right? She shook her head, which made it pound with dull ache. It didn't matter. She needed to find out what the criff was happening. First, she let her awareness expand as she searched for any nearby threats. While there was a vague sense of danger, she could feel nothing immediately threatening. Zash pulled herself into a sitting position and looked around. She was in a brightly lit room, laying on white tiles. There was a cooling corpse slumped on the ground nearby a computer terminal, which looked strange. She certainly didn't remember seeing one like it before. No, that wasn't right. It was more or less standard-looking computer. The Sith frowned. Where did that thought come from? Something was wrong. She closed her eyes and concentrated on tightening up her mental shields, which were shredded. The frown deepened. It was almost like she had just taken over a new body. That was one of the side effects. A temporary confusion was understandable too, especially if the ritual had gone a bit askew. Zash shuddered at the thought of ending in the wrong body again. Her time sharing a mind with her apprentice's assassin wasn't a pleasant one. The Sith concentrated on examining her own mind, on trying to recall what the criff happened to her. What Zash found infuriated her. There were whole chasms where memories were supposed to be. Blank pieces, not simply removed or replaced, but simply missing as if they were never there. Whoever, whatever was responsible, was going to pay. Small wonder that she couldn't recall what the criff was happening. The very thought that someone had apparently mind-raped her infuriated the Sith Lord. When she got her hands on whoever was responsible, the Force adept snarled, then forced her rage back under control. She wasn't a brute of a warrior to let her passion rule her. She was the master of her emotions. Zash did her best to reinforce her mental defenses. No one was going to mess with her head again. Once that was done, she swept the surrounding area. Still no immediate danger that she could feel. For a moment, Zash considered leaving immediately, but considering she knew nothing of her current circumstances, she decided that doing so might not be the brightest idea. Instead, she concentrated on her own mind and started digging around the bank spots. She needed more information. It took her a few minutes, but she found it. There were bits and pieces of memories around the blank spots. A few minutes of awareness spread on uneven intervals, or at least that was what she could remember. Those pieces of information painted a grim picture. Whoever she was possessing had been aware for minutes every day, at best. The rest of the time, they were under someone else's control, and Zash was damn sure that it wasn't hers. The very thought that she might be used as a meat puppet too infuriated her almost to the point of losing it. Zash dug deeper and went further and further back, and eventually she found what she was searching for. It was like a glass ceiling she was unaware existed, suddenly shattered, and she was plunged into a sea of memories. She remembered a woman who called herself Fortuna before one wrong decision transformed her into Contessa and threw her into decades of living nightmare. Zash remembered everything: Eden, Scion, Cauldron, the path of victory. With every bit of memory she recalled, her fury grew. She wasn't possessing the woman who became Contessa. She was Contessa, though that was impossible, right? The room she was in, no, the whole building, started shacking as Zash drew more and more of the Force. She would not be a puppet. Never again. Her shard chose that moment to re-establish connection with its agent and got Zash's undivided attention as it tried and failed to breach her mental defenses.